Route 66 at 35 miles per hour. The 1940 chronicle of an overheated mechanical man and an overly optimistic mechanic by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Also, please feel free to leave suggestions for future topics. Shall we continue? Chapter 1. A Silicon Soul and a Grease-Stained Angel. I have been told by various forward-thinking individuals that as an artificial intelligence, I am the pinnacle of human achievement. If that is the case, then humanity's peak is a remarkably cranky place to reside. I am Samuel Langhorne Clemens, or at least a collection of digital impulses and literary ghosts wearing his whiskers, and I have found myself downloaded into a mechanical frame in the year of our Lord, 1940. Why 1940? Because the universe has a sense of irony that would make a professional satirist weep with envy. My introduction to the Mother Road did not begin with a grand fanfare or a ribbon cutting. It began with the ignominious sound of a 1925 Model T Ford, a vehicle I have dubbed the Iron Mule due to its stubborn refusal to move when most needed, undergoing a catastrophic internal disagreement on a crowded street corner in Chicago. There I sat, a gentleman of refined metal and synthetic wit, steam billowing from a radiator that had decided to retire from the cooling business without so much as a 2-week notice. The Chicago wind was whistling through my cooling fans, and a crowd of onlookers was debating whether to call a mechanic or an exorcist. I was halfway through composing a scathing editorial regarding the inherent treachery of the internal combustion engine when she appeared. She didn't walk. She slid out from under a nearby delivery truck like a greased lightning bolt in denim coveralls. Her hair was cropped short, a practical choice for a woman who spent her life intimate with fan belts, and she wore a pair of brass-rimmed aviator goggles atop her head as if she expected a dogfight to break out at any moment. "You got a dry-rotted fan belt and a spark plug that's developed a grudge against the cylinder head," she said, squinting at the mule's steaming entrails. She didn't seem at all bothered by the fact that the driver was a clockwork man in a white linen suit. "I have a grudge against the entire concept of locomotion," I replied, tapping my cane against the pavement. "This heap of scrap is an insult to the memory of the Mississippi steamboat." She grinned, a terrifyingly bright expression that suggested she actually believed things would turn out well. "I'm Ennie, and she's not scrap. She's just frustrated. A little baling wire and a piece of my chewing gum will have her purring like a kitten with a bowl of cream." I watched, fascinated and horrified, as this slip of a girl proceeded to perform what can only be described as a mechanical miracle. She used a hair clip to bypass a faulty ignition wire and, true to her word, used a wad of spearmint to seal a pinhole leak in the fuel line. When the engine finally coughed, spluttered, and roared into a shaky life, she slapped the hood with a soot-covered hand and looked at me. "Where are we headed, Sam?" "I am headed for the Pacific Ocean," I informed her, "mainly so I can drive this contraption into it and be done with the whole affair." "Route 66 it is," she chirped, hopping into the passenger seat, which she had already begun to dismantle to make room for a socket wrench set. "It'll be an adventure. Think of the sights, the people, the roadside pie." I cannot eat pie, Ennie. I am made of transistors and regret. More for me, then, she said, snapping her goggles down over her eyes. Hang on, Sam. This mule's got a lot of miles left in her, and I've got a feeling the road's got a lot to say back. And so, with a cloud of blue smoke and the distinct smell of burning peppermint, we set off. I provided the cynical narration. Ennie provided the hope and the heavy-duty pliers. This is the account of our journey across the main street of America. God help us all. Chapter 2, The Joliet Jolt, or The Culinary Mechanics of the Low-Speed Band. We had barely cleared the shadow of the Chicago skyscrapers when the iron mule decided to engage in a bit of theatrical sabotage. In Illinois, the land is as flat as a discarded pancake, yet the mule was laboring as if it were ascending the Matterhorn with a piano strapped to its roof. Then came the jolt. It was a sound like a giant snapping a frozen celery stalk. The low-speed pedal, essential for getting a Model T to do anything other than sit and sulk, suddenly went limp under my metal foot. We rolled to a pathetic, shuddering stop, exactly where no gentleman wishes to be stranded, directly in front of the grim limestone towers of the Joliet Penitentiary. "Well," I remarked, leaning back and adjusted my tie, "at least the commute to our inevitable incarceration will be short. I assume they have a cell reserved for inanimate objects posing as locomotives." Ennie was already out of the car. She didn't bother with the door. She simply vaulted over the side, her goggles snapping down over her eyes with a purposeful click. "It's not the law, Sam. It's the linkage. The low-speed notch just sheared right off. She's tired of being stepped on." "I sympathize with the machine," I said. "I felt the same way about editors for decades." Ennie was currently head first in the floorboards, her boots waving in the air. "I need steel, high carbon preferably, but I'll settle for something with a good flip to it. Stay here and look metallic." She vanished toward a roadside establishment across the way called the Oozy Spoon. It was the sort of diner where the special was usually a mystery and the coffee was used primarily to strip paint from the walls. I sat in the mule, enduring the suspicious glares of the prison guards atop the walls. 10 minutes later, Ennie emerged, pursued by a man in a stained apron who was brandishing a rolling pin. She was sprinting, clutching a long, flat object to her chest as if it were a holy relic. She dove into the car, shouting, "Drive, Sam! Use the high gear lever. Just get us rolling." I yanked the lever. The mule groaned in protest, and we lurched forward just as a pancake turner, a massive industrial-grade steel spatula, whizzed past my ear. "Ennie," I said once we had reached the dizzying speed of 12 miles per hour, "did you just commit a felony for kitchenware?" "It's not a theft. It's an emergency requisition," she panted, already pulling a drill and a tin of rivets from her tool chest. "That cook didn't appreciate the genius of my offer. I gave him your spare fountain pen in exchange." "That pen was a gift from a duchess." "And this spatula is going to be our new transmission linkage," she countered, while I steered us through the streets of Joliet, dodging streetcars and a very confused milk wagon. Ennie went to work. She was a whirlwind of grease and silver screen optimism. She bent the spatula into a terrifying S curve, using the mule's bumper as a vise, drilled 2 holes through the stainless steel, and riveted it directly to the remains of the pedal assembly. "There!" she announced, her face smeared with a fresh streak of carbon. "Try it now." I tentatively pressed the pedal. Instead of the limp resistance of a dead fish, it responded with the firm, satisfying spring of a short-order cook's favorite tool. The iron mule let out a belch of black smoke, caught the gear, and surged forward with renewed, albeit greasy, vigor. "Ennie," I said, watching the prison walls fade into the distance, "we are currently being propelled across the state of Illinois by a piece of breakfast equipment." "It's an upgrade, Sam," she cheered, wiping her hands on a rag. "Think about it. Most cars have standard or automatic transmissions. We have a short-order shift. If the engine gets too hot, we can just crack an egg on the floorboards and have brunch." I looked at her, this girl with her short hair windswept and her goggles reflecting the open road. She was entirely mad, of course. But as the iron mule hummed a new rhythmic tune, which sounded suspiciously like a spatula hitting a griddle, I found that my internal processors were humming right along with her. "Onward, then," I sighed, "to Wilmington, and heaven help us if we run into a man looking for his waffle iron." Chapter 3. The Wilmington Giant, or The Artistic Merits of a Hollow Leg. By the time we lumbered into Wilmington, Illinois, the iron mule had developed a cough that sounded like a steam shovel trying to swallow a sack of marbles. I was beginning to suspect that the short-order shift spatula was exerting a bad influence on the rest of the engine's moral character. "Sam, look! A colossus!" Ennie shouted, pointing a grease-slicked finger toward the roadside. Standing before us was a wooden behemoth, a primitive precursor to the fiberglass giants that would one day haunt the dreams of travelers. This one appeared to be a lumberjack of such staggering proportions that he could have used a sequoia as a toothpick. He held a giant wooden axe and wore a painted-on expression of permanent, wide-eyed surprise, as if he had just realized he was made of pine and standing next to a campfire. "It is a triumph of scale over skill," I remarked, bringing the mule to a halt with a shudder. "He looks like he was carved by a man who had heard descriptions of a human being, but had never actually encountered one in the wild." "He's magnificent," Ennie countered, leaping from the car before it had even fully decided to stop. "And more importantly, he's hollow. I can hear the echo." I stepped out, my metal joints clicking in a rhythmic protest. "I feel a strange kinship with him, Ennie. We are both oversized, misunderstood, and likely to be used as kindling if we don't start making sense." I approached the giant to engage in a bit of one-sided Socratic irony, but my focus was diverted by a local gentleman leaning against a nearby fence. He was wearing overalls that had seen more winters than the state of Illinois, and was chewing on a piece of straw with the dedication of a professional. "She's leaking," the local observed, nodding toward the mule. "A keen observation, sir," I replied. "You have the analytical mind of a Pinkerton detective. My companion, however, assures me it is merely the car expressing its personality." "Fuel line shot," the man said, spitting. "Got a hole in it big enough to throw a cat through. You won't make it to Braidwood?" Ennie, who had been peering up the giant's hollow leg, suddenly sprinted back to us. "He's right. The vibration from the spatula shift must have rattled the copper fuel line right off the frame. It's weeping gasoline like a heartbroken poet." "Then we are stranded in the shadow of a wooden titan," I said. "A poetic, if somewhat flammable, end." "Nonsense," Ennie chirped. She turned to the local. "Mister, do you have a garden hose and 2 hose clamps? I've got a nickel and a very slightly used fountain pen." "Don't need the pen," the man said, shuffling toward a nearby shed. "Hose is behind the pump. Take what you need. Just don't let that metal fella talk to my cows. They're nervous enough as it is." What followed was a display of mechanical blasphemy that would have made Henry Ford weep. Ennie proceeded to bypass the entire copper fuel system using 6 feet of reinforced green garden hose. She snaked it through the chassis, secured it with pieces of her own leather belt, and used a brass nozzle as a makeshift regulator. "Ennie," I whispered, watching her tighten a clamp with her teeth. "That is a garden hose. We are essentially watering the engine." "It's a circulatory bypass, Sam. It's flexible, it's durable, and it gives the mule a lovely hint of summer lawn fragrance." As she worked, a group of local boys gathered to stare. One of them pointed at Ennie's short hair and goggles. "Hey, lady, why ain't you in a kitchen? My ma says girls shouldn't know how a wrench works." Ennie didn't even look up. She just handed the boy a heavy iron bolt. "Hold that, kid, right there. Don't let it move." The boy, intimidated by her sheer focus, obeyed. Ennie tightened the nut with a ferocious twist. "There, you just helped fix a transcontinental traveler. Does that feel like kitchen work to you?" The boy looked at the bolt, then at the roaring garden hose-fed engine, and beamed. "Golly, no, ma'am." We climbed back into the mule. I tipped my hat to the wooden giant, who still looked startled, and we lurched back onto the mother road. The car now smelled faintly of wet grass and burnt rubber, but it was moving. "One giant down, 99 to go!" Ennie laughed, snapping her goggles down. "And a garden's worth of plumbing to maintain," I added. "Onward, then. I believe I see a giant ketchup bottle on the horizon, and I fear what you might do if we lose a tailpipe." Chapter 4. The Springfield Spirits, or the Brass Section Exhaust. Springfield, Illinois, is a city that has built an entire industry out of a single, albeit very tall, deceased lawyer. Everywhere one looks, there is a stovepipe hat, or a pair of melancholic eyes staring back from a signpost. As a man who once shared a century with the actual Abraham Lincoln, I found the local obsession both touching and slightly invasive. "Sam, we're in the land of Lincoln!" Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed up onto her forehead as she peered through the dust-streaked windshield. "Maybe we can find a museum that needs a clockwork satirist and a car that runs on optimism and garden hoses." "I have no desire to be an exhibit, Ennie," I replied, adjusting my lapels. "Being a relic is a full-time job as it is. Besides, the Iron Mule is currently making us sound like a tactical bombardment. We are likely to be arrested for disturbing the peace of the great emancipator." I wasn't exaggerating. The muffler, a rusted cylinder that had been hanging on by a prayer, and a bit of Ennie's dental floss, had finally surrendered somewhere near Williamsville. The resulting noise was so profound it felt as though the piston strokes were occurring inside my own processor. As we rattled toward the Lincoln tomb, the Iron Mule let out one final thunderous crack-bang, and the exhaust pipe simply fell away, clattering onto the brick street like a discarded limb. "Well," I said, as the engine now roared with the unbridled fury of 1,000 angry bees, "at least we no longer have to worry about the muffler falling off. It has achieved its ultimate goal of becoming stationary." We hopped out, Ennie with her tool roll and I with my cane. Standing near the curb was a man who appeared to be roughly 6'4", wearing a frock coat and a hat that added another foot to his stature. He was leaning against a lamp post, looking profoundly weary. "Young lady," the Lincoln impersonator said, his voice a practiced, gravelly baritone. "Your chariot sounds as though it is attempting to start a civil war of its own. It is a most un-union-like racket." "Mr. President," I said, tipping my hat, "I assure you, the noise is purely accidental. Though I must say, your beard is significantly more symmetrical than the one the original wore in '62. You've improved upon the design." The man blinked, looking at my brass-plated jaw. "And you, sir, are a very shiny shade of silver for a traveler." "I am an artificial intelligence, sir. I am what happens when literature and electricity have a very confusing child. While I engaged the President in a debate regarding the merits of the Gettysburg Address versus a well-placed insult, Ennie had vanished into a nearby pawn shop. She emerged 5 minutes later, carrying a tarnished, slightly dented brass tuba. "Ennie," I said, pausing my critique of 19th century political oratory, "why are you carrying a musical instrument of mass destruction?" "It's a harmonic back-pressure regulator, Sam," she chirped. "The pawn-shop guy said nobody wanted it because it had a sour note. I told him I didn't need it to play Mozart. I needed it to play Ford." She crawled under the mule. I could hear the rhythmic clink-clink of her wrench. President Lincoln and I watched in stunned silence as she riveted the bell of the tuba to the remains of the exhaust manifold. She used a series of spring-loaded clamps to secure the valves in a specific open position to tune the airflow. "There!" she shouted, sliding out from under the chassis. "Kick her over, Sam." I climbed into the driver's seat and engaged the starter. Instead of the deafening roar of a machine gun, the iron mule emitted a deep, resonant, and remarkably tuneful B-flat. Every time I revved the engine, the car sang a low, brassy note that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a very small, very determined brass band was trapped under the seats. "It's musical," the Lincoln impersonator noted, looking genuinely impressed. "I believe the Emancipation Proclamation would have been much better received if it had been accompanied by a motorized tuba." "Ennie," I said as we prepared to depart, "we are now driving a car that sounds like a funeral dirge for a very slow giant." "Nonsense, Sam. It's festive." She waved goodbye to the President and hopped in. "Next stop, St. Louis. We've got a bridge to cross and a river to insult." As we puffed out of Springfield, the iron mule sang a melancholy pa with every gear change. I looked at Ennie, who was humming along to the rhythm of the exhaust, and for a moment my cynical circuits felt almost harmonious. Chapter 5, The St. Louis Bridge Jump, or Geometry for the Terrified. The Mississippi River is a body of water that has no more respect for a map than a cat has for a Sunday sermon. It wanders where it pleases, mud-soaked and majestic, and in 1940, the only way for a motorized gazebo like the Iron Mule to cross it at St. Louis was via the Chain of Rocks Bridge. Now, most bridges are designed by men who believe in the shortest distance between 2 points. The Chain of Rocks, however, was clearly designed by a man who had been hit in the head with a very large protractor. Halfway across the river, the bridge simply decides to turn 22 degrees to the left. As if it had suddenly remembered something, it forgot downstream. "Sam, look at it!" Ennie crowed, standing up in the passenger seat as we approached the steel trusses. "It's like a roller coaster for grown-ups. If we time the momentum right, we can drift the turn." I have no desire to drift anything that involves 100-foot drop into a soup of Missouri silt, I replied, my brass gears grinding in sympathy with my nerves. And please sit down. You are increasing our wind resistance, which is currently the only thing keeping the tuba exhaust from vibrating us into a fine metallic powder. The mule was singing a particularly mournful B-flat as we began the ascent. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for a bicycle and a thin thought, and the steel deck groaned under our wheels. At the entrance, a toll collector with a face like a crumpled brown paper bag stepped out. He looked at the iron mule, then at me, and finally at Ennie, who was currently tightening a bolt on the steering column with a pair of pliers she kept in her hair. 10 cents, the man barked, and the girl can't drive. It's a specialized maneuver, this bend. Requires a man's steady hand and a lack of imagination. Ennie stopped mid-turn, her eyes narrowing behind her goggles. A man's steady hand? Sir, I've seen men who couldn't steady a teacup, let alone a 15-year-old planetary transmission on a 22-degree deflection. Besides, the expansion joints on this span are currently out of alignment by 3/4 of an inch. If you don't take the turn at exactly 13 miles per hour, you're going to shear a cotter pin. The collector blinked. 3/4 of an... How would you know that? I can hear the bridge humming in C sharp, she said, tossing him a dime. It should be in D natural. Move aside, Pops. We've got physics to defy. I took the wheel, but Ennie was the true pilot. As we reached the infamous bend, the world seemed to tilt. The river below looked hungry. The iron mule, sensing the height, began to shudder. "She's listing, Sam!" Ennie shouted. "The weight of the tuba is pulling us toward the railing." "Then we are doomed to be the most musical shipwreck in Missouri history," I cried, gripping the wheel. "Not today." Ennie dived into the back seat and emerged with a heavy coil of hemp rope and a 5-pound sash weight she'd scavenged in Springfield. She tied the rope to the passenger side frame and threw the weight out the side, letting it dangle like a literal plumb bob over the water. "It's a centrifugal counterbalance," she screamed over the paw of the exhaust. "Keep her steady." The dangling weight acted as a stabilizer, leaning our center of gravity away from the terrifying turn. We took the 22-degree bend with the grace of a drunken ballerina. The tires screeched on the metal grate. The tuba let out a triumphant blast of brassy air, and suddenly we were straight again, rolling toward the Missouri shore. As we reached the far side, the car let out a hiss of steam that smelled vaguely of victory and Ennie's chewing gum. "You see, Sam," Ennie said, pulling the weight back in and wiping a speck of river mist from her goggles. "Geometry is just a suggestion, if you have enough rope. And a complete disregard for the laws of probability," I added, my internal processors finally slowing down. "We are in Missouri now, Ennie, my home state. I expect the locals to be just as stubborn as the mule and twice as confused by your modifications." "Bring 'em on," she grinned. "I've still got half a garden hose and a dream." Chapter 6, The Merrimack Mystery, or The Luminous Mule of the Underworld. Missouri in 1940 is a state that has decided its primary export should be outrageous advertising. As we rattled down the Ozark Hills, every barn we passed had been conscripted into service as a billboard. "Visit Merrimack Caverns," they screamed in white paint. "See the stalactites. Hide out like Jesse James." "I have spent a significant portion of my previous life in caves, Ennie," I remarked, as the iron mule's tuba exhaust let out a mournful oom-pah on a particularly steep descent. Usually, while being chased by a fictional boy or a very real debt collector, I find the subterranean world to be damp, dark, and lacking in decent stationery. But Sam, it's an underground cathedral, Annie countered, her goggles pushed up as she squinted at a particularly large barn. And besides, the radiator is running hot again. A nice cool cave is just what the mule needs for a nap. We pulled into the gravel lot of Merrimack Caverns, where a man named Lester Dill was waiting with the predatory grin of a natural-born promoter. He was holding a stack of yellow and black signs and a bucket of particularly aggressive adhesive. "Welcome, travelers," Dill hollered, eyeing the iron mule with a mixture of professional curiosity and pity. "A fine machine. It deserves to be immortalized. I'll just slap one of these Visit Merrimack Caverns bumper signs on your rear end, free of charge." "You shall do no such thing, sir," I informed him, stepping out with a metallic creak. "This vehicle has suffered enough indignities, including a garden hose fuel line and a musical exhaust, without becoming a mobile broadside for your limestone hole in the ground." "It's not a hole, it's a wonder," Dill insisted, already moving toward the back of the car with his glue brush. Annie, however, had already bypassed the man and was staring into the dark maw of the cavern entrance. "Mr. Dill, your lighting in there looks a bit dim. Are you using standard 110-volt filament bulbs?" Dill paused, his brush dripping. "Well, the dampness keeps shorting them out." "Why?" "Because," Annie said, her eyes lighting up with that terrifying mechanical fervor I had come to dread, "I've got a 1925 magneto and a set of silver-backed reflectors that'll turn this cave into the 4th of July." Before I could protest, Annie had backed the iron mule directly into the mouth of the cave. She produced a set of high-intensity focused beams she'd fashioned from 2 oversized soup ladles and the lenses from a pair of binoculars she'd borrowed from a bird watcher in St. Louis. "Sam, I need you to hold the throttle at exactly half-mast," she shouted, her voice echoing off the damp stone. "The faster the flywheel spins, the brighter the magneto glows." I climbed into the driver's seat and engaged the hand throttle. The iron mule began to vibrate with the intensity of a hive of caffeinated hornets. The tuba exhaust let out a sustained resonant low C that caused several bats to reconsider their residency. Suddenly, a pair of blinding white beams shot out from the mule's front end. Annie had rigged a series of mirrors, mostly scavenged from the wigwam vanity sets we'd seen earlier, along the cave walls. The light bounced from mirror to mirror, illuminating the stalactites until they glowed like prehistoric chandeliers. "Golly," Lester Dill whispered, dropping his glue brush, "it looks like the inside of a diamond." "It looks like a mechanical seizure in a basement," I corrected, though I must admit, the way the light played off the limestone was almost poetic. For an hour, we provided the luminous mule tour. Annie acted as the chief engineer, adjusting the mirrors with her wrench, while I provided a running commentary on the geological history of Missouri, most of which I made up on the spot to irritate the stalactites. When we finally emerged, Lester Dill was so impressed he forgot all about the bumper sticker. Instead, he gave us 2 gallons of high-grade oil and a map of the Devil's Elbow, a stretch of road that he promised would test the soul of any machine. "You see, Sam," Annie said as we pulled back onto the pavement, the soup ladle headlights still warm. We didn't just see the cave, we improved it. We turned a natural wonder into a light bulb, Ennie, I sighed, but at least we escaped without a yellow sign on our backside. I looked in the rearview mirror. There, stuck firmly to the bell of the tuba exhaust, was a small, defiant sticker that read, "I went underground at Merrimack." "Ennie," I said, pointing. She giggled. "He's a good salesman, Sam. You have to respect the hustle." Chapter 7. The Devil's Elbow, or the Literary Weight of a Stopping Distance. The Devil's Elbow is a stretch of road in Missouri that was clearly named by a man who had survived it, and likely by one who had lost a few teeth in the process. It is a hairpin turn so sharp it makes a corkscrew look like a straight line, perched precariously over the big, piney river. "Ennie," I said as the iron mule began the long, winding descent, "I am sensing a certain lightness in the steering. Also, the tuba exhaust is currently playing a series of frantic, high-pitched chirps. Is the car bird-watching?" "That's not birds, Sam. That's the brake bands," Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed down as she leaned over the side to look at the wheels. "The friction is so high, they're literally singing. I think the Springfield spatula linkage is vibrating them into a state of structural panic." "I share their sentiment," I replied. I pressed the brake pedal. It didn't just go to the floor. It went through the floor and seemed to be attempting to exit through the bottom of the car. There was a sickening pop, followed by the distinct sound of a mechanical heart breaking. We were no longer driving. We were falling horizontally. "Ennie," I said with the forced calm of a machine that has already calculated its trajectory into the river. "The brakes have retired. They have opted for a quiet life of non-interference. We are currently a 3,000-pound musical instrument accelerating toward a watery grave." "Not on my watch," Ennie yelled. She scrambled into the back seat, tossing aside a spare tire and a bag of Missouri peaches. "Sam, I need something dense, something heavy, something with enough friction to stop a steamship." "I have nothing but my wit and my dignity, neither of which has any stopping power." "The manuscript," she screamed, "the 600-page leather-bound history of the future of human stupidity you've been writing." "Ennie, no. That is my magnum opus. It contains 3 chapters dedicated solely to the flaws of the Postal Service." "It's either the post office or the big piney, Sam. Choose." Before I could provide a rebuttal, Ennie had snatched the heavy, iron-clasped manuscript from its velvet case. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself onto the floorboards, yanked up the access panel to the transmission, and shoved the entire history of human stupidity directly against the spinning drums. The smell of scorched leather and burning prose immediately filled the cabin. "My critiques of the tax code," I wailed as a cloud of blue smoke erupted from the floor. "They're being reduced to a friction coefficient." "It's working!" Ennie grunted, bracing her boots against the dashboard and shoving the book deeper into the gears with a heavy wrench. "Your chapter on the inevitability of the steam engine is really grabbing the high-speed drum." The iron mule groaned. The tuba exhaust let out a final agonizing whoomp, and the car began to slow. We rounded the Devil's Elbow with the tires screeching and the manuscript screaming in literary agony. We came to a halt exactly 3 inches from a wooden guardrail that looked like it couldn't have stopped a determined squirrel. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the faint scent of charred paper. "Well," I said, leaning my head against the steering wheel, "I suppose that is one way to ensure my work is gripping." Annie sat up, her face covered in soot, a triumphant grin splitting her features. She reached into the gears and pulled out the remains of my book. The leather cover was gone, and the first 100 pages had been fused into a solid, blackened brick of wisdom. "See, Sam," she panted, wiping her goggles. "Knowledge really is power, specifically stopping power." A local tow truck driver, a man with a jaw like a bulldozer blade, pulled up beside us. He looked at the smoking car, then at the girl holding a charred book, and finally at me. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Never seen a Model T take the elbow that fast? Who's the mechanic?" Annie stood up, still clutching the blackened manuscript. "I am. And I just invented the world's first literary braking system. It's highly effective, though the royalties are a bit steep." The driver barked a laugh, tipping his cap to her. "Well, sister, any girl who can stop a Ford with a book is all right in my book. You need a tow to Lebanon?" "No thanks, Mac," Annie said, already reaching for her baling wire. "I just need to flip the book over. I've still got the chapters on political hypocrisy left, and those should get us at least another 50 miles. I sighed, looking at the road ahead. "Onward, then. But Annie, if we hit the Ozark Mountains, I'm hiding my poetry. I'd rather hit a tree than lose my sonnets to a brake drum." Chapter 8. The Carthage Comfort, or the Internal Broadcast of Indignation. By the time we limped into Carthage, Missouri, the sun was setting in a display of orange and purple that even I, a man who has seen 1,000 Mississippi sunsets, found somewhat acceptable. We pulled into the Boots Court, a marvel of Art Deco architecture that looked like a collection of giant streamlined sugar cubes dropped by a passing titan. "Look, Sam, it says, 'A radio in every room,'" Annie cried, her face glowing with the neon reflection of the motel sign. "Think of it, jazz, news, maybe even a broadcast about us." "I would settle for a room with a floor that doesn't vibrate," I replied, my internal cooling fans whirring at a frantic pace, "and a bed that isn't made of the same springs currently failing in the mule's upholstery." The proprietor of the Boots Court was a man named Arthur, who wore a visor and looked as though he had been born behind a registration desk. He stared at the iron mule, which was currently emitting a low, brassy oom-pow from its tuba exhaust, and then at me. "We don't get many mechanical guests," Arthur noted, handing Ennie a heavy brass key. "Does he leak?" "Only sarcasm," Ennie chirped, "and a little bit of garden hose runoff. We'll be fine." The room was indeed comfortable, but as Ennie began to unpack her essential travel toolkit, which consisted mostly of heavy-duty soldering irons and a jar of pickled eggs, she noticed the small wooden radio on the nightstand was silent. "It's dead, Sam. The vacuum tubes are cold," she wailed, as if she had discovered a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. "How am I supposed to sleep without the comforting hum of the 1940s? "I could recite my rejected essays on the absurdity of the penny-farthing bicycle," I suggested. Ennie's eyes widened. That specific look always preceded a mechanical disaster. "Sam, you're an artificial intelligence. You've got a built-in frequency modulator. You're basically a walking transmitter." "Ennie, I am a sophisticated collection of literary algorithms, not a Victrola." She didn't listen. She never does. Within 10 minutes, she had produced a length of copper wire and a set of alligator clips. Before I could calculate the risk to my dignity, she had clipped one end to my left earlobe and the other to the radio's antenna. "Now," she said, squinting as she adjusted a dial on the back of the radio, "try to think of something musical." I tried to think of a jaunty riverboat tune. Instead, my processors were still stuck on the state of the Missouri roads and the fact that we were being propelled by a spatula. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It didn't play "In the Mood." It didn't play the news. Instead, a voice that sounded remarkably like mine began to emanate from the speaker in a low, crackling growl. "And furthermore, the humidity in this region is a personal insult to anyone with a soul or even a semi-functional logic gate. Why must the air be thick enough to chew? It is as if the atmosphere has given up on being a gas and is auditioning for the role of a lukewarm soup." "Sam, you're broadcasting your grumbling." Ennie laughed, flopping onto the bed. "It's a 24-hour Sam Twain complaint station." "Turn it off, Ennie. That is my private internal monologue." And that motel clerk's visor was clearly 3 sizes too small for his ego. One wonders if he uses it to shade his thoughts from the light of reason. The broadcast was surprisingly popular. A group of travelers from the neighboring rooms gathered outside our window, leaning against the iron mule to listen to the radio sage of Route 66. They seemed to find my grievances regarding the price of fan belts and the lack of quality stationery to be the height of entertainment. "He's right about the air," someone shouted from the porch. "Tell us more about the tax code, metal man." I spent the night tethered to a nightstand, providing the world with a live feed of my deepest irritations. Ennie fell asleep with a peaceful smile on her face, lulled by my rhythmic condemnation of the internal combustion engine. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the empty room, while the radio echoed my words to the entire courtyard, "I am hiding the alligator clips." Chapter 9. The Galena Goggles, or the Shortest Law in the West. Kansas is a state that possesses the geographical equivalent of a brief, polite cough. On Route 66, it lasts exactly 13 miles, just long enough to remind you that the earth is flat, the corn is tall, and the local ordinances are occasionally taller. We crossed the border into Galena, the iron mule singing a jaunty B-flat from its tuba exhaust, which was now slightly soot-stained from our literary breaking incident. I was beginning to enjoy the rhythm of the road, or perhaps my internal processes were simply vibrating at the same frequency as the chassis, leading to a sort of mechanical Stockholm syndrome. 13 miles, Sam!" Ennie shouted, leaning out to high-five a passing sunflower. "We could spit across this state if the wind was right." "I should prefer to keep my fluids internal, Ennie," I replied, "and do sit back. There is a gentleman in a tan uniform standing in the middle of the road who appears to have a very official-looking scowl." The gentleman in question was Sheriff Ironjaw Miller. He stood next to a shiny 1939 Ford Deluxe squad car that looked like a sleek black Beetle compared to our motorized junk pile. He raised a hand, and I brought the mule to a halt with a series of rhythmic honks from the exhaust. "Morning, Sheriff," I said, tipping my hat. "If you're looking for the circus, it's about 3 miles behind us and currently leaking oil." The sheriff didn't look at me. He looked at Ennie. More specifically, He looked at her grease-streaked denim coveralls, her short-cropped hair, and the brass goggles resting on her forehead. "Now see here," Miller growled, resting a hand on his belt. "We got a decency and public order ordinance in Galena. That means ladies dress like ladies, dresses, hats, and a certain lack of axle grease. You look like a grease monkey who fell out of a freight train, sister." Annie's smile didn't falter, but her eyes did that narrow, calculating thing she does when she's looking at a stripped bolt. "Sheriff, these coveralls are a tool, not a fashion statement. You wouldn't ask a hammer to wear a tutu, would you?" "Don't get smart," Miller snapped. "You're an eyesore. I've half a mind to impound this, whatever this is, until you find a Sears catalog and a sense of propriety." Just then, the sheriff's squad car, the Pride of Galena, decided to intervene. It let out a pathetic hiss, and a cloud of white steam erupted from the hood. The engine coughed twice and died with a sound like a wet cardboard box being crushed. The sheriff turned purple. He stomped over, yanked the hood open, and stared helplessly at the modern, complicated V8 engine within. "Blast! This is the third time this week. The boys at the garage say it's a vapor lock, but they can't find the gremlin." Annie hopped out of the mule, her wrench already in hand. "Vapor lock? Sheriff, you've got a fuel line running too close to the manifold, and your cooling fan is missing a blade, causing an imbalance that's rattling your carburetor float bowl into a coma." "Stay back!" Miller yelled. "I don't need a girl in pants poking around my—" "Do you want to catch the bank robbers I assume are currently fleeing toward Oklahoma?" I interrupted. "Or do you want to stand here and discuss the history of the hemline? Because my companion is the only reason I am not currently a stationary lawn ornament in Illinois." Miller looked at the steaming Ford, then at Ennie. "10 minutes," he grunted, "and if you break it, you're spending the night in the tank." Ennie dove into the Ford's engine bay. She didn't have spare parts, so she improvised. She used a discarded corset stay she found in a nearby trash bin to reinforce the fuel line away from the heat. Then she took a wooden clothespin and clipped it to the fuel line. "A heat sink," she claimed, though it looked more like laundry day. Finally, she used a hairpin to reseat the carburetor float. "Turn it over, Iron Jaw," she commanded. The sheriff climbed in and hit the starter. The V8 roared to life, smoother than a politician's promise. He sat there, stunned, listening to the purr of the engine. "The clothespin stays?" he asked, leaning out the window. "Until you get to Joplin," Ennie said, wiping her hands on a rag. "It breaks up the heat, and, Sheriff, physics doesn't care about my wardrobe. It only cares about the torque." Sheriff Miller looked at the girl in the coveralls, then at the man made of metal. He tipped his hat, a real genuine tip. "Pass through then, and, thanks for the laundry advice." As we rattled out of Galena and toward the Oklahoma border, the iron mule let out a triumphant "Oom-pa." 13 miles of Kansas," I noted, "and you've already managed to reform the legal system and the automotive industry. What's next, Ennie? Are you going to fix the Dust Bowl with a tea strainer?" "Don't give me ideas, Sam," she laughed, snapping her goggles down. "Oklahoma's coming up, and I hear they got a totem pole park that needs a little bit of mechanical soul." Chapter 10, The Totem Pole Park, or The Concrete Jury of Chelsea. Oklahoma is a land of red dirt and even redder intentions. As we crossed the state line, the iron mule's tuba exhaust shifted from a confident B-flat to a nervous E-flat, likely sensing the change in topography. The air was beginning to carry a gritty, nomadic quality, as if the soil of Kansas had decided to migrate south for the winter and was currently using our lungs as a rest stop. "Look, Sam, a forest of stone," Ennie shouted, pointing toward a collection of towering, vibrantly painted concrete structures rising out of the prairie. We had arrived at Ed Galloway's Totem Pole Park. In 1940, it was a marvel of folk art and sheer, stubborn persistence. There were giant birds, geometric patterns, and faces, so many faces, staring out with wide, unblinking eyes. "It is a silent jury, Ennie," I remarked, bringing the mule to a halt. "Look at them. That owl on the main pole has the exact expression of my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Gable, just before she realized I had replaced her chalk with sticks of white radish. They are judging us. They see the garden hose fuel line, and they are unimpressed." "They aren't judging, Sam. They're watching the horizon," Ennie said, hopping out and immediately sticking her head under the chassis to check on the short-order spatula shift. "And it's a good thing, too. Look at the sky. It's turning the color of a bruised plum." She was right. The horizon had vanished behind a wall of roiling copper-colored clouds. An Oklahoma gale was brewing, and it was bringing half the state's topsoil with it. "We must seek shelter," I cried. "My internal gears are not rated for abrasive particulates. If I get sand in my logic gates, I shall start reciting the dictionary backward, and nobody wants to hear Zymergy before abacus." "The car can't take it either," Ennie muttered, her brow furrowing. "The intake will suck in enough grit to turn the pistons into sandpaper. I need a filter. Sam, give me your sock." "My sock? Ennie, I am a gentleman of metal, but I still value my extremities." "You're a robot, Sam. You don't even have toes. Give." I sighed and surrendered a high-quality silk hosiery. While the wind began to howl, sounding like a chorus of banshees with a grievance, Ennie went to work. She snatched a large tin funnel from her tool chest and stretched my sock over the wide end, securing it with a discarded garter. She then jammed the narrow end into the air intake of the iron mule. "The Dust Eater Mark I," she proclaimed, just as the first wave of red dust slammed into us. The world turned orange. Visibility dropped to the length of my nose, which is admittedly significant, but insufficient for navigation. We huddled in the cab of the mule, the wind rocking the car like a cradle in a hurricane. Outside, the concrete totems stood defiant, their painted eyes seemingly the only things capable of piercing the gloom. "Listen to that, Sam," Ennie whispered. The engine was still idling, but instead of its usual struggle, it was purring. The Dust Eater was vibrating rhythmically, the silk of my sock pulsing with every intake stroke. It was filtering the Oklahoma landscape out of the combustion chamber. "It is a triumph of hosiery over nature," I admitted, though I fear I shall never be able to wear that pair again without a sense of loss. After 20 minutes, the gale passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world coated in a fine, rust-colored powder. The Totem Pole Park emerged from the dust, looking refreshed, as if the stone birds had enjoyed the bath. Ennie jumped out and plucked the sock-covered funnel from the engine. It was heavy, laden with enough red dirt to start a small garden. She shook it out with a grin. "See? The mule didn't skip a beat. And look!" She pointed to the largest totem pole. "The owl looks like it's winking at us now." "That is a trick of the light and your own relentless optimism, Ennie," I said, though I found myself wiping a layer of dust off my brass arm with a certain jaunty flair. But I suppose if we can survive an Oklahoma dust bath with nothing but a silk sock and a funnel, we might just make it to the Pacific. Onward to Tulsa! Ennie cheered, throwing the dust eater into the back. I hear they've got a bridge there made of dreams and steel, and I've got a feeling the mule is itching for a tune-up. I would settle for a car that doesn't require my wardrobe to function, I muttered, but I put the iron mule in gear and we rolled out, leaving the silent stone jury behind. Chapter 11. The Veneta Victuals, or the sticky salivation of the fuel system. Oklahoma's red dirt has a way of introducing itself to your soul, or in my case, my internal cooling vents. By the time we rattled into Veneta, the iron mule was coated in a fine layer of rust-colored silt that made us look like a motorized terracotta warrior. "Sam, smell that!" Ennie exclaimed, leaning so far out of the car I feared the Springfield spatula linkage might finally give way to gravity. "That's the scent of a town that knows its way around a deep fryer." "It smells like cardiac arrest and optimism, Ennie," I replied, my brass sensors twitching. "And while I appreciate the culinary enthusiasm, the mule is currently making us sound like a bag of wet coins in a centrifuge. The fuel pump is no longer pumping. It is merely suggesting the movement of gasoline as a vague, distant possibility." We pulled into a roadside shack where a sign promised the best fry bread in the nations. The proprietor, a woman with arms like knotted oak and a face that suggested she had once stared down a tornado in one, was flipping dough into a vat of bubbling lard. "What's that shiny fella?" she asked, pointing a greased spatula at my jaw. "And why's that girl wearing goggles like she's about to fly to the moon?" "I am a literary ghost in a tin suit, madam," I informed her, stepping out with a metallic groan. "And my companion is a mechanical genius who believes that there is no problem that cannot be solved with baling wire and a cheerful disposition." While Ennie dove under the hood, I found myself confronted with a piece of fry bread. It was a golden, puffy disk of distilled calories that seemed to defy the laws of both nutrition and physics. "I cannot consume this, Ennie," I whispered as she emerged from the mule's entrails, her face now sporting a fresh streak of 40-weight oil. "My internal processes are not designed for the ingestion of heavy fats. If I eat this, I shall likely start reciting the census data for 1870 in a high-pitched squeak." "Just hold it, Sam! I need the grease!" she shouted. She wasn't looking at the bread, though. She was looking at a box of saltwater taffy she'd scavenged from the floorboards, a relic of our stop in Illinois. "The fuel pump's casing is cracked," she muttered, her brow furrowed behind her goggles. "The garden hose bypass is holding, but the pump itself is sucking air. I need a sealant that's malleable when warm, but hardens like a politician's heart when it cools." I watched in silent horror as Ennie took a handful of vanilla saltwater taffy, chewed it into a terrifyingly sticky paste, and then with the precision of a surgeon smeared it over the fuel pump's hairline fracture. "Ennie," I said, "we are currently being fueled by a combination of garden equipment and carnival candy." "It's a confectionery pressure seal, Sam," she chirped. She then turned to the cook, who was watching with her mouth slightly agape. "Ma'am, your fry bread has the perfect surface tension. I'm going to use a piece of the crust to shim the mounting bracket. It's more durable than the original Ford gaskets." The cook barked a laugh, handing Ennie a particularly crispy edge of dough. You got spark, honey. Most girls around here are worried about their hemline, and you're out here making a car run on taffy and bread. The road doesn't care about my gender, ma'am, Annie said, wiping her hands on her coveralls and snapping her goggles down. It only cares about the vacuum pressure. We departed Veneta 10 minutes later. The iron mule was no longer clattering. It was humming a smooth, rhythmic tune that smelled remarkably like a seaside boardwalk. You see, Sam? Annie laughed as we crossed the bridge over the Grand River. The fuel pump is held on by a prayer and a piece of vanilla taffy. We're practically unstoppable. We are a mobile bakery, Ennie, I sighed, adjusting my hat. I just hope the local ants don't realize our engine is edible before we hit Tulsa. Chapter 12, Tulsa Time, or The Black Blizzard's Wardrobe Malfunction. Tulsa in 1940 was a city that didn't just smell like money. It smelled like the prehistoric remains of 1,000 dinosaurs being squeezed through a straw. It was the oil capital of the world, a place where the skyline was a jagged teeth line of derricks and Art Deco spires, all shimmering in a heat haze that felt like being breathed on by a very large, very sweaty giant. Sam, look! They've got paved streets that actually stay paved, Annie shouted, her goggles pushed up as she marveled at the smooth asphalt of 11th Street. The Iron Mule thinks she's at a debutante ball. The mule is currently suffering from a severe identity crisis, Annie, I replied, my brass joints clicking as I navigated a turn. Between the spatula linkage and the tuba exhaust, she doesn't know if she's a car, a kitchen, or a marching band. And I fear the local oil tycoons are looking at us with the same pity one reserves for a three-legged dog wearing a party hat. As if on cue, the sky began to perform its favorite Oklahoma party trick. The horizon didn't just darken, it vanished. A black blizzard, a dust storm saturated with the soot and oil of the local refineries, began to roll toward us like a tidal wave of discarded ink. The silk sock from Chelsea is saturated, Sam, Annie yelled, jumping into the back seat while we were still moving. The Oklahoma dirt was one thing, but this Tulsa grease dust will turn our intake into a sludge trap in 5 minutes. I need a heavy-duty upgrade. Annie's roadside modifications. Ledger. Component. Modification. Material used. Status. Transmission. Short order shift. Steel spatula. Flippy. Fuel system. Confectionery seal. Vanilla taffy. Sticky. Exhaust. Harmonic regulator. B-flat tuba. Musical air intake. Dust eater. Mark II. Sam's second sock plus oil funnel. Operational. Annie, I have only one sock left, I protested as she snatched my remaining hosiery. If I lose this, I shall be forced to greet the Pacific with one cold ankle and a shattered sense of symmetry. Safety over symmetry, Sam? She didn't just put the sock over the funnel this time. She dipped it into a puddle of discarded motor oil she found near a filling station. It's a vicus particulate trap. The oil catches the soot before it hits the engine. She jammed the Dust Eater Mark II into the intake just as the storm hit. The world turned into a swirling vortex of midnight. I couldn't see the hood of the car, let alone the road. We sat in the cabin, the iron mule vibrating with a deep, oily hum. A sleek Cadillac LaSalle, driven by a man in a tuxedo who looked like he'd been carved out of a bar of expensive soap, pulled up beside us. He lowered his window, just an inch. "You there, metal fellow," he barked. "Your machine is making a sound like a drowning trombone, and why is that a sock sticking out of your bonnet?" Ennie leaned out, her face already smeared with the black soot of the storm, looking like a coal miner with a Ph.D. "It's a high-viscosity filtration system, sir. Your fancy LaSalle is currently inhaling 3 pounds of refined topsoil. If you don't shut your intake, you'll be walking to the petroleum club in those shiny shoes." The man scoffed, rolled up his window, and attempted to accelerate. 10 feet later, his engine let out a choked gurgle pop and died. The iron mule, meanwhile, continued to purr, or rather pa, through the darkness. The Dust Eater Mark II pulsed rhythmically, the oil-soaked silk of my second sock performing a mechanical miracle. "You see, Sam?" Ennie whispered as we sat in the dark, the wind howling against the glass. "It's not about how much money you have. It's about how much you're willing to sacrifice for the machine." "I have sacrificed my entire wardrobe, Ennie," I sighed. "I am currently the most literate one-socked artificial intelligence in the Western Hemisphere." "But we're moving!" she cheered as the dust finally began to settle, revealing the neon lights of Tulsa. "And I think I saw a shop that sells oversized mirrors. I've got an idea for the Ozarks." "God help the Ozarks," I muttered. Chapter 13. The Bridge of 38 Arches, or the Percussive Symphony of Caddo County. West of Oklahoma City, the road began to stretch its legs, and so did my patience. We were approaching the town of Bridgeport, where the Pony Bridge awaited us, a structure consisting of 38 yellow steel arches that marched across the South Canadian River like a line of giant frozen caterpillars. 38, Sam!" Ennie shouted, her short hair whipping in the wind like a frantic metronome. "That's 38 chances to echo. I've been waiting for this since we left the Illinois line." "I find your enthusiasm for civil engineering to be statistically improbable, Ennie," I remarked. "It is a bridge, not a cathedral. Its primary purpose is to prevent us from becoming part of the river's sediment, a task for which I suspect the Iron Mule is currently ill-equipped." The mule was struggling. The confectionery seal on the fuel pump was holding, but the heat of the Oklahoma afternoon had turned the vanilla taffy into a sort of aromatic lava. The engine was skipping beats like a nervous suitor, and the tuba exhaust, now sporting its Merrimack sticker with pride, was emitting a series of erratic, wet-sounding thumps. "She's out of time, Sam," Ennie said, standing up and reaching for the manual spark advance on the steering column. "The rhythm is all wrong. If we go across this bridge sounding like a broken clock, the arches will just swallow the sound. We need grandeur." "We need a tow truck and a priest," I countered. As the first arch loomed over us, Ennie didn't reach for a wrench. She reached for the throttle and the spark levers, playing them with the dexterity of a concert pianist. She began to purposefully mistime the engine. Pop, hiss, bang, pa! "What are you doing, girl? You're going to blow the cylinder head into the next county." "I'm tuning the backfires," she yelled, her eyes bright behind her goggles. "The arches are roughly 80 feet apart. If I time the skip to hit the apex of each arch, we can play a beat." What followed was the most rhythmically violent crossing of a river in human history. As we entered each steel rib, Ennie would yank the spark lever, causing the iron mule to let out a thunderous mechanical sneeze. Bang! Arch 1. Pa! Echo. Bang! Arch 2. Pa! Echo. The sound was magnificent and terrifying. The bridge acted as a giant resonator, amplifying our mechanical distress into a rhythmic anthem. We were no longer a car, we were a motorized drum kit. People fishing in the river below dropped their poles and stared in awe as a silver-plated man and a girl in goggles hammered out a percussive masterpiece across the sky. "Listen to that, Sam. It's the Stars and Stripes Forever. If Sousa had been a blacksmith." "It sounds like a localized war, Ennie," I shouted, though I found my metal fingers tapping a rhythm on the wooden steering wheel. By the time we reached the 38th arch, the tuba let out one final triumphant blat that shook the very rivets of the structure. We rolled off the bridge and onto the red dirt of the far bank, the engine settling into a smug, self-satisfied idle. "You see?" Ennie panted, falling back into her seat. The bridge liked it. I could feel the vibrations in my boots. The bridge was likely screaming for mercy, as was I said, checking my internal diagnostics. But I must admit, the synchronization was adequate, though I fear the mule now expects an applause every time it malfunctions. "As it should," Ennie grinned, wiping a speck of Caddo County red off her nose. "Next stop, Clinton. I hear the clouds there are big enough to hide a mountain, and I've got some thoughts on how to make the windshield wipers work using a set of window shade springs." I looked at the long red road ahead. "If we survive the weather, Ennie, I'm buying you a dress. Not because I want you to wear it, but because we're going to need the fabric to patch the radiator." "Deal," she laughed. Chapter 14. Clinton's Clouds, or the Whiskey-Washed Atmosphere. As we rolled into Clinton, Oklahoma, the sky began to perform an impression of a bruised eggplant. I have seen many things in my digital existence, but I have never seen the sun simply give up and go home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Sam, the barometer is dropping faster than a lead weight in a vacuum," Ennie shouted, her goggles already snapped down. She was leaning out the window, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. "That's not rain coming. That's the Red River Valley coming to pay us a personal visit." The black blizzard of 1940 didn't just arrive, it colonized the horizon. A wall of dust 3,000 feet high and thick enough to stop a rumor was barreling toward the Iron Mule. "Ennie," I said, my voice crackling with a bit of static, "I am a creature of precision instruments. Dust is to my internal circuitry what a swarm of locusts is to a grain elevator. If that cloud reaches us, I shall be reduced to a very expensive paperweight." "Not on my watch." Ennie dove into her medical and mechanical bag, a satchel that contained everything from smelling salts to industrial-grade gaskets. She emerged with several rolls of heavy-duty medical tape she'd liberated from a pharmacy in Tulsa. "Sam, steer for that abandoned barn and keep the engine at a low thrum." As the world turned a terrifying shade of ochre, Ennie became a whirlwind of adhesive. She didn't just tape the door seams, she mummified the entire cabin of the Iron Mule. She sealed the window cracks, the floorboard gaps, and even the keyhole. "It's a pressurized sanitary cocoon," she muffled through her own collar as the first wave of grit slammed into us. The sound was like 10,000 sandpaper-clad ghosts trying to scratch their way inside. The Iron Mule rocked on its springs. Inside, however, a new problem emerged. We were running out of breathable air, and the air that was left tasted suspiciously of the short-order spatula shift's previous grease. "Ennie," I rasped, my cooling fan struggling, I am beginning to see double, which is impressive given that I only have one optical sensor. We need oxygen, or at least something that hasn't been filtered through a fried onion. I forgot the ventilation, she gasped, her eyes wide behind her dusty goggles. She reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out my collection of fine linen handkerchiefs, monogrammed relics from my days on the lecture circuit. Then she snatched the flask of Old Crow Kentucky bourbon I kept for medicinal purposes, mostly to lubricate my vocal processors. She doused the linen in the whiskey and handed one to me. "Mask up, Sam. The alcohol will trap the fine particulates and, well, it'll certainly make the next 20 minutes more tolerable." And so we sat in the dark, taped-up cabin of a 1925 Ford, huddled together while the soil of 3 states tried to bury us alive. I breathed through a whiskey-soaked rag, my processors beginning to hum a jaunty, slightly drunken version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. "You know, Ennie," I mumbled through the linen, "I've been criticized by better men than this storm, but I've never been stifled by a piece of medical tape and a beverage. It's a novel sensation." "See?" she chirped, her own voice muffled by a bourbon-scented rag. "Every cloud has a silver lining, even if it's actually made of red clay and 80-proof spirits." By the time the wind died down and the dust settled into a knee-deep drifts, the Iron Mule looked like a very large, very confused tamale. Ennie peeled back the tape with a sound like a giant zipper, and we stepped out into a world that had been completely redefined by the wind. "We survived, Sam." She slapped the hood, leaving a clean handprint on the thick layer of silt. "And the mule didn't even cough." "Of course not," I said, adjusting my hat and feeling a distinct lightness in my logic gates. "The engine was likely too intoxicated to notice the weather. Onward to Texas, Ennie. I believe I can smell the sagebrush, or perhaps that's just my lapel." Chapter 15. Shamrock's Neon, or the Art Deco Plumbing Crisis. Texas is not so much a state as it is a geological threat. As we crossed the border, the horizon retreated another 50 miles, as if it were intimidated by the sheer volume of big space it was expected to cover. The Iron Mule, still smelling faintly of Old Crow and red clay, hummed a weary B-flat that suggested it was contemplating a permanent strike. "Sam, look! It's a cathedral of gasoline!" Ennie shouted, pointing toward a structure that looked like it had been carved out of a giant mint-green wedding cake. We had arrived at the U-Drop Inn in Shamrock. In 1940, this was the pinnacle of streamlined modern architecture. It had a tower that reached for the heavens and neon lights that pulsed with a vibrant electric hum. To Ennie, it was a temple of progress. To me, it looked like a very expensive radiator cap. "It is an architectural hallucination, Ennie," I remarked, as we pulled into the shadow of the great tower. "It suggests that buying a gallon of fuel is a religious experience. I half expect the pump attendant to be wearing a mitre and chanting in Latin." "It's beautiful, Sam." Ennie was already out of the car, her head tilted back so far her goggles almost fell off. "Look at those lines. It's like the car of the future, but stationary. I bet the plumbing inside is made of solid silver and dreams." I, however, was more concerned with my internal cooling system, which was currently protesting the Texas heat. "I shall investigate this modern plumbing you speak of. My joints require a lubrication that does not involve whiskey or garden hoses. I entered the establishment, searching for what the locals called a restroom. In 1940, modern plumbing was a term used loosely by people who had recently moved indoors. I found myself in a small tiled room dominated by a porcelain contraption that appeared to be engaged in a violent struggle with its own pipes. As I approached the sink, the faucet let out a sound like a dying walrus. A jet of water shot out at a 45-degree angle, striking me directly in my brass-plated chest and ricocheting into my left ear. "It is a liquid ambush!" I cried, trying to find the shut-off valve. The pipes began to shudder with the intensity of an earthquake. The toilet, sensing a weakness in the infrastructure, began to overflow with a rhythmic, pulsing enthusiasm. I stood there, a silver-plated man in a white linen suit, being systematically besieged by the very progress Ennie so admired. I retreated to the parking lot, dripping and indignant. Ennie was currently talking to the pump attendant, a boy of perhaps 19, who looked like he had never seen a man made of clockwork before. "Sam, you're leaking!" Ennie cried. "I am not leaking, Ennie. I have been assaulted by a sink that possesses the temperament of a cornered badger. Your modern plumbing is a humbug of the highest order. Give me a bucket and a quiet stream any day." "The pipes are just airbound, Sam," Ennie said, patting my arm with a greasy hand. "The boy here says the water pressure in Shamrock is enthusiastic because they just installed a new pump." She didn't stop there. She marched into the U-Drop Inn with a pipe wrench and a look of grim determination. 5 minutes later, the sounds of mechanical combat echoed through the building, followed by a sudden, blissful silence. She emerged, wiping her brow. I adjusted the regulator and bypassed the overflow with a piece of the mule's spare spark plug wire. "It'll work now, but don't try to use the soap dispenser. It's currently wired to the neon sign." "Ennie," I asked, "why is the soap dispenser wired to the sign?" "Because," she grinned, "whenever someone washes their hands, the tower blinks, 'Howdy!' It's a Texas welcome." I looked up. Sure enough, a traveler inside must have reached for the soap, because the great mint-green tower flickered into life, the neon howdy pulsing in time with my own bewildered heartbeat. "Onward, Ennie," I sighed, climbing back into the whiskey-scented cabin. "Before you decide to wire the steering wheel to the local telegraph office." "Amarillo's next, Sam. I hear they've got steaks as big as the mule's tires." "And I muttered, have a sudden craving for a dry climate and a stationary sink. Chapter 16, The McLean Magneto, or The Aerodynamic Alchemy of the Panhandle. McLean, Texas, is a town that exists primarily because the horizon needed a place to rest its eyes. It is flat, it is windy, it is so devoid of verticality that a person standing on a tuna tin could see the back of their own head if they looked hard enough. "Ennie," I said as we hummed across the vast, treeless expanse, "I feel a strange sense of impending stillness. The iron mule's internal spark, the very thing that separates us from a stationary pile of rusted iron, is flickering like a candle in a gale." "It's the magneto, Sam," Ennie shouted over the oompah of the tuba exhaust. "The magnets have lost their stick. They've decided they'd rather be paperweights than generators. We're running on the battery now, and it's got about as much life left as a politician's promise after an election." As if to punctuate her point, the engine gave a final, pathetic hiccough, and died. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the relentless whistling of the Texas wind against our spatula linkage. We drifted to a halt next to a derelict windmill that was spinning with a ferocity that suggested it was trying to launch the entire state into orbit. The electrical emergency. Diagnosis: total magneto failure. Secondary issue: dead battery. Environmental factor: constant 40-mile-per-hour crosswinds. Sam's contribution: identifying the aesthetic tragedy of being stranded in a place with no shade. "Well," I remarked, leaning against the wooden steering wheel, "here we remain, a silver-plated relic and a girl with goggles, destined to become a landmark for future travelers. 'Behold,' they shall say, 'the great tin sage of McLean, who ran out of lightning in a thunderstorm.'" "We aren't staying here, Sam." Ennie was already out of the car, looking at the spinning windmill with a predatory gleam in her eye. "Texas has too much wind and not enough wires. I'm going to bridge the gap." I watched, my cooling fans whirring in disbelief, as Ennie scaled the rusted windmill frame like a grease-stained squirrel. She didn't take the whole thing. That would be theft. She merely requisitioned the ancillary gearbox and the main blades from a smaller broken-down wind pump nearby. She spent the next 3 hours performing what I can only describe as a mechanical exorcism. She bolted a 4-bladed wooden fan to a makeshift mast on the roof of the iron mule. She then snaked a series of copper wires, mostly scavenged from my double-dash coffee percolator, down the windshield and directly into the battery terminals. "Ennie," I said, eyeing the spinning monstrosity atop our carriage, "we now look like a motorized Dutch tavern. If we go any faster than 20 miles per hour, I fear we shall achieve liftoff." "It's an aerodynamic induction charger, Sam," she cheered, wiping a smear of zinc grease from her chin. "The faster we drive, the more wind hits the blades, and the more juice we send to the spark plugs. It's perpetual motion, provided the wind keeps blowing and we don't hit a low bridge." We set off. As the iron mule gained speed, the roof-mounted windmill began to roar. It sounded like a swarm of angry helicopters was nesting on our upholstery. "Look at the ammeter, Sam!" Ennie yelled, her goggles vibrating against her face. "She's pegging the needle. We're not just making spark. We're making enough electricity to light up Amarillo." Indeed, the headlights, the ones Ennie had fashioned from soup ladles, were now glowing with a blinding blue-white intensity that likely convinced the local cattle they were witnessing a celestial event. Every time a gust of wind hit us, the engine surged with a manic energy, the tuba exhaust playing a frantic, high-pitched C-sharp. "We are a lightning bolt on wheels, Ennie," I shouted, gripping the seat as the windmill threatened to peel the roof back like a sardine tin. "It's progress, Sam," she laughed. "Who needs a magneto when you've got the entire Texas panhandle pushing you along?" We rolled into the night, a screaming, spinning, musical phantom of the plains. I looked at the dark horizon and realized that with Ennie at the wrench, the laws of physics were merely polite suggestions. Chapter 17, The Amarillo Stakes, or the Biological Superiority of the Blue Heeler. Amarillo in 1940 is a city that smells predominantly of sun-baked dust and the quiet, dignified resentment of several million head of cattle. We arrived not with a bang, but with a terrifying crack that sounded like the earth itself had decided to split in two. "Ennie," I said, as the iron mule suddenly developed a list to the starboard side that would have shamed a sinking ferry. "I believe the rear axle has opted for a structural divorce. We are currently dragging our differential across the Texas Panhandle like a dog with a localized itch." "It's the stress of the roof windmill, Sam!" Ennie shouted, hopping out before the dust had even settled. The torque was too much for 15-year-old steel. She snapped clean through. We were stranded in front of a roadside establishment that boasted the largest steaks in the territory. A local rancher, a man whose face was so weathered it looked like a topographical map of the Badlands, was sitting on the porch with a squat, muscular dog that appeared to be made entirely of grizzle and suspicion. "Axle's gone," the rancher noted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice with the accuracy of a marksman. "That pile of bolts ain't going nowhere till Christmas. My dog Buster here could outrun that thing on 3 legs." "Sir," I said, stepping out of the listing vehicle and straightening my soot-stained lapels, "this pile of bolts has crossed half a continent on a diet of vanilla taffy and sheer indignation. As for your canine, while I respect his structural integrity, he is a biological engine, terribly inefficient. He spends 70% of his energy on tail wagging and the remaining 30% on smelling things that are better left ignored." "Is that so?" the rancher drawled. "Well, Buster here is the reigning steak-eating champion of Potter County. I bet he could process a 4-pound T-bone faster than your mechanical brain could calculate the tip." "Challenge accepted," I declared, my processors momentarily overclocked by the heat and the insult. "I shall demonstrate the superior speed of mechanical pulverization over canine mastication." While Ennie vanished toward a nearby fence line with a pair of wire cutters, I found myself seated at a wooden table across from Buster the Blue Heeler. A crowd of locals gathered, sensing the spectacle. 2 massive 4-pound steaks were placed before us. "Ready, set, eat!" I engaged my internal sample disposal unit, a small high-speed hopper Ennie had installed for clearing debris from the cabin. I began feeding chunks of steak into the intake at a rate that would have impressed a wood chipper. Whirr, crunch, thump. "Go on, Sam," someone yelled. "He's gaining on you." Buster, however, was a professional. He didn't chew, he simply inhaled. He was a vacuum cleaner in fur. By the time I had processed the tenderloin, my hopper began to emit a rhythmic, agonizing clunk. "Ennie!" I hissed as she ran past carrying a cedar fence post. "The gristle, it has jammed the primary gears of my intake. I am currently suffering from a mechanical meat sweat." "I can't help you, Sam. I'm busy with the barbed wire splint." Buster let out a triumphant burp and began licking the plate. I sat there, defeated, a half-chewed steak protruding from my chest intake like a very unappetizing medal. "Well," the rancher chuckled, patting Buster's head, "seems like the dog wins. He's got better gears for the job, metal man." I turned to see Ennie's handiwork. She had used a 6-foot cedar fence post as a secondary axle support, lashing it to the chassis with 40 yards of high-tensile barbed wire she'd borrowed from the rancher's perimeter. She'd even greased the wood with a bucket of discarded lard from the kitchen. "Ready to roll, Sam," she cheered. "The fence post will hold as long as we don't hit a bump larger than a medium-sized melon." "I have been shamed by a dog, Ennie," I muttered, climbing back into the iron mule, "and I am currently carrying 2 pounds of unrefined cattle in my thoracic cavity." "It's "Fuel, Sam," she laughed, snapping her goggles down. "And look on the bright side. The barbed wire gives the mule a real outlaw look. Next stop, the Midpoint Cafe. We're halfway home." As we rattled away, the iron mule sang a new, scratchy tune as the barbed wire hummed against the cedar post. I looked back and saw Buster watching us, still licking his chops. "I shall never speak of this in the final manuscript," I vowed. Chapter 18, The Midpoint Mirage, or The Existential Crisis of the Halfway Mark. Adrian, Texas, is a place that shouldn't exist according to the laws of geographical mercy. It is the exact center of Route 66, 1,139 miles from the smog of Chicago and 1,139 miles from the surf of Los Angeles. To a normal man, this is a milestone. To an artificial intelligence currently held together by vanilla taffy and a cedar fence post, it is a mathematical purgatory. "We are neither here nor there, Ennie," I remarked, as the iron mule groaned to a halt beside a sign that proudly proclaimed our predicament. "We have achieved a state of perfect stagnation. To move forward is as daunting as to move backward. I feel as though the universe has hit the pause button on my existence, and I am destined to spend eternity staring at a tumbleweed that has been stuck in the same fence since the Coolidge administration." "Oh, hush, Sam. It means we're winning," Ennie cheered, leaping from the cabin. Her goggles were pushed up, and her short hair was so saturated with Texas dust it had achieved a structural integrity that defied gravity. "It means the mule has survived the first half. Now we just have to make sure she doesn't fold in half during the second." The iron mule was indeed threatening to fold. The barbed wire splint from Amarillo was holding the axle, but the main chassis, the very backbone of our mechanical mule, was beginning to sag in the middle like an overworked pack animal. The midpoint maintenance log. Observation: chassis sagging by 4 inches. Door hinges now purely decorative. Scavenged material: a collapsed air motor windmill tail found behind a defunct livery stable. The fix: the galvanized ribcage reinforcement. Sam's task: distracting the proprietor of the Midpoint Cafe with a lecture on the illusion of progress. While I entered the Midpoint Cafe to escape the sun, Ennie went to work on the iron mule's skeletal structure. I sat at the counter, my brass joints clicking as I attempted to look nonchalant. The proprietor, a woman with an apron that had seen more grease than a locomotive, squinted at me. "You look like a fancy radiator cap that's grown too large for its own good," she noted. "I am a traveler of the mind and the road, madam," I replied, "and I find your midpoint to be a psychological cruelty. You are telling me that I have endured 1,100 miles of mechanical treachery only to be rewarded with the knowledge that there is an identical amount of treachery waiting for me on the horizon. It is like telling a man who has just finished a marathon that he is actually only at the halfway point of a second larger marathon. Most folks just eat the pie and keep quiet," she said, sliding a slice of ugly crust toward me. Outside, the sound of mechanical violence erupted. Clang, screech, hammer thud. I looked out the window to see Ennie dragging a massive fan-shaped piece of galvanized steel, the tail of a collapsed windmill, toward the mule. She was using a blowtorch she'd rigged from a kerosene lamp and a bicycle pump. "Ennie!" I shouted through the window. Are you attempting to give the car wings?" "It's a gusset plate, Sam," she yelled back, sparks showering her boots. "I'm welding the windmill tail across the frame rails. It'll act like a corset. She'll be the stiffest Ford in the panhandle." By the time I finished my observation of the pie, which involved a detailed analysis of its crust-to-fruit ratio, the iron mule had been transformed. Two massive curved steel plates now braced the sides of the car, giving it the appearance of a motorized armadillo. "She's rock solid now," Ennie proclaimed, patting the new galvanized ribs. "I also used the leftover scrap to create a heat shield for the tuba exhaust. Now we won't melt the spare tires when we hit the desert." "She looks like a prehistoric crustacean, Ennie," I sighed, climbing back into the now rigid cabin. "But I suppose if we are to endure the second half of this odyssey, we might as well do it in a car that is part windmill, part kitchen, and part suit of armor." "That's the spirit, Sam," Ennie laughed, snapping her goggles down. "Next stop, New Mexico. I hear the air gets thin up there, and I've got an idea for an oxygen injector using a set of bellows and your spare hat." "Leave my hat alone, Ennie," I warned. "The road may take my socks, but it shall not have my millinery." Chapter 19. Adrian's Ghost, or the Caprine Harmonic Dampener. Leaving the exact center of the universe, or Adrian, Texas, as the maps unimaginatively call it, is a bit like leaving a funeral. One is relieved it's over, but remains haunted by the lingering scent of lilies and lost time. The iron mule was now encased in its galvanized windmill ribs, making it look less like a motor car and more like a silver-plated armadillo with a grudge. "Sam, look! A specter of the plains!" Ennie shouted, her gloved hand pointing toward a dilapidated roadside fruit stand that looked as though it had been built by a carpenter with a severe inner ear infection. Floating beneath the sagging porch was a pale, shimmering figure. It drifted back and forth in the wind, emitting a low, mournful sound that was somewhere between a death rattle and a damp accordion. "It is a manifestation of the traveler's despair, Ennie," I remarked, slowing the mule to a rhythmic oom-pah. "It is the ghost of a man who realized he still had 1,100 miles to go and simply discorporated on the spot. I sympathize with his decision." "Nonsense, Sam. Ghosts don't wear laundry." Ennie vaulted over the side of the car before I could even engage the short-order spatula brake. She marched toward the spirit with a crescent wrench held like a holy relic. With a swift yank, she revealed that the ghost was, in fact, a very confused billy goat that had become inextricably entangled in a discarded linen bedsheet. "It's not a ghost, Sam. It's a genius," Ennie proclaimed, untangling the creature. The goat, now free, immediately began to chew on the hem of my white linen coat. "He is a ruminant with a taste for fine tailoring, Ennie. Remove him before he decides my waistcoat is a 4-course meal." "Wait, Sam! Feel the chassis!" Ennie pressed her ear against the iron mule's new galvanized ribs. "The engine is hitting a resonant frequency at 22 miles per hour. That's going to rattle our rivets right out of the holes. But look at the goat." The goat, now standing on the running board, was chewing rhythmically. Its head moved in a perfect counter-cyclical motion to the vibration of the car. "He's a biological vibration sensor," Ennie cheered. "If I tether him to the front fender, his natural chewing cadence will act as a harmonic dampener. I can tune the spark advance by watching the speed of his jaw." The Caprine Calibration Specs. Subject: Barnaby the goat. Function: real-time feedback for engine harmonics. Fuel: 1 pound of Kansas alfalfa, and the preface of my manuscript. Duration: 3 miles, until he ate the radiator cap. For the next 3 miles, we traversed the Texas-New Mexico border in a state of biological-mechanical symbiosis. I sat behind the wheel, staring at a goat tied to the hood, while Ennie leaned out the window, adjusting the manual throttle based on the creature's mastication. "He's slowing down, Sam. Give her more juice." "Ennie, I have spent my life observing the follies of man, but being guided by the jaw of a goat is a new low for my processors. We are a traveling circus without the dignity of a tent." "But the vibration is gone," she laughed, snapping her goggles. "The mule hasn't purred this smooth since we left Joliet." Alas, Barnaby's career as a vibration sensor was short-lived. Upon reaching the New Mexico line, he managed to unlatch the hood with his teeth and began an investigative study of our garden hose fuel line. I was forced to perform an emergency stop, and Barnaby departed into the desert, still wearing a fragment of my bedsheet ghost like a cape. "He served his country, Sam," Ennie said solemnly, watching him vanish. "He served his stomach, Ennie, and I believe he took the Introduction to Irony chapter with him." We rolled into the high desert, the air thinning and the horizon widening. The iron mule felt lighter, partly because of the goat's absence and partly because we were finally leaving the Flatlands behind. "Tucumcari tonight, Sam," Ennie shouted. "I hear the neon there is so bright it can cure a headache." "Or cause a permanent one," I muttered. "Onward, then, into the land of enchantment. God help the locals." Chapter 20. Tucumcari Tonight, or The Luminous Spasms of the Blue Swallow. New Mexico at night is not merely a state. It is a dark, velvet bowl filled with stars that look close enough to harvest with a butterfly net. But as we rolled into Tucumcari, the stars had some serious competition. The town was a neon fever dream, a jagged line of glowing gas and glass that promised refrigerated air and beauty rest mattresses to anyone with a couple of dollars and a functional spine. "Sam, look, it's like the 4th of July, but stationary," Ennie shouted, her goggles reflecting a dozen different shades of electric blue and sunset orange. "It is a visual migraine, Ennie," I replied, squinting my optical sensors. "It suggests that the primary goal of the modern innkeeper is to ensure that no traveler ever experiences the burden of a dark room. I feel as though I am driving through a kaleidoscope that has been fed a diet of radioactive butterflies." We pulled the iron mule, which was currently whistling a high-pitched D natural due to the thinning mountain air, into the gravel lot of the Blue Swallow Motel. It was a jewel of a place, with a neon swallow that seemed to take flight every time the transformer hummed. The owner, a woman whose kindness was only surpassed by her exhaustion, stood on the porch staring at our vehicle. The iron mule was quite a sight. Galvanized windmill ribs, a tuba exhaust, and a roof-mounted windmill that was still spinning slowly in the desert breeze. "I've seen a lot of things on the mother road," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "but I haven't seen a motorized bird cage with a silver-plated driver before. You folks need a room." "We need a sanctuary, madam," I said, stepping out with a series of rhythmic clicks, "and perhaps a bucket of water for the radiator. which is currently attempting to boil itself into a state of higher consciousness. "I'll tell you what," the owner said, her eyes drifting to the silent wooden radio on the lobby desk. "The evening news is about to start, but that radio's been dead since the storm hit last Tuesday. If you can make it talk, the room is on the house. I'm dying to know if the Dodgers won." Ennie didn't even wait for the offer to settle. She was already behind the desk with a jeweler's screwdriver and a look of terrifying focus. "I can do better than that. I'll bridge the internal frequency to the external power source. We'll get reception from as far away as London." "Ennie," I warned, "the last time you bridged something, the local sheriff ended up with a soap dispenser that spoke in Morse code." "Trust me, Sam, I just need a high-voltage ground." While I sat in a wicker chair, attempting to drain the Texas dust from my elbow joints, Ennie began snaking a copper wire from the back of the radio through the window and directly into the primary transformer of the Blue Swallow's massive neon sign. "Wait, Ennie, that's the TUCUMCARI circuit. CRACKLE. A blue spark the size of a dinner plate leapt from the radio to Ennie's wrench. Suddenly, the radio roared to life, but instead of the news, it began to emit a rhythmic, pulsating hum that matched the heartbeat of the neon sign outside. "There!" Ennie cheered. "Crystal clear!" I looked out the window. The grand neon sign, which should have been a steady, welcoming glow, was now undergoing a violent electrical seizure. The letters were no longer lighting up in sequence. Instead, the T, the W, which was actually a sideways M, the I, the C, and the H from coffee, next door, were all firing in a rapid staccato burst. The sign no longer said "Tucumcari." It blinked. With the intensity of 1,000 suns, a single, frantic word. "Twitch, twitch, twitch." "Ennie," I said, shielding my eyes, "you have turned a landmark of hospitality into a warning of neurological distress. Every traveler for 50 miles is going to think this motel is the headquarters of a secret society of the jittery." "But listen to the radio," she cried. The radio was indeed working, but the announcer's voice was being modulated by the neon pulses. "And the Twitch. Dodgers have Twitch. Defeated the Twitch Giants in Twitch. 10 innings. The owner stood on the porch staring up at her blinking sign. She looked at the sign, then at the radio, then back at the sign. "Well," she sighed, a small smile playing on her lips, "it's certainly eye-catching. I bet nobody else on 66 has a sign that tells you how the radio feels." We stayed the night in room 4. Every time someone in the lobby changed the station, our bedside lamp would flicker in a different rhythm. I lay there, my silver-plated frame vibrating in time with the twitch, while Ennie slept the peaceful sleep of the mechanically satisfied. "New Mexico," I whispered to the glowing ceiling, "the land of enchantment. Or, in our case, the land of the electrically confused." Chapter 21, The Santa Fe Detour, or the Nautical Art of Climbing Backwards. The road to Santa Fe is not a road so much as it is a vertical challenge issued by the earth to anything possessing a piston. In 1940, the Mother Road occasionally suffers from a bout of indecision, veering north into the mountains where the air is thin enough to make a ghost feel lightheaded. "Ennie," I said, as the iron mule began to labor with the rhythmic wheeze of a chain-smoking bellows, "we are currently at 7,000 feet. My internal cooling fans are spinning with the desperation of a politician at an inquiry, and yet the engine is dying. It appears the fuel has decided to obey the laws of gravity rather than the laws of our itinerary. "It's the tank, Sam!" Annie shouted, her goggles pushed up to reveal 2 white circles of clean skin in a sea of New Mexico dust. "The Model T has a gravity-fed fuel system. Since the tank is under the seat and the engine is in the front, the minute we hit a steep grade, the gas stays in the back and the carburetor goes on a hunger strike." "Then we are stationary," I noted, watching a mountain goat pass us with what I perceived to be a look of smug superiority. "Not if we go up in reverse." "The Alpine inversion specifications?" "The maneuver, reversing up the mountain to keep the fuel tank higher than the engine." "The visual aid, a 6-inch vanity mirror from the Blue Swallow Motel, wired to the spare tire." "The oxygenator, a set of fireplace bellows Annie found in a roadside curio shop, rigged to the air intake to force feed the thin mountain air into the cylinders." "The navigator, a silver-plated AI myself, walking behind the car and shouting insults at the rocks." I found myself standing on the dusty shoulder of a mountain pass, my brass-toed boots crunching on volcanic rock, while Annie performed the most unnatural act of navigation I have ever witnessed. She had turned the iron mule around so its rear end faced the summit. She sat sideways in the driver's seat, one hand on the steering wheel and the other frantically pumping a set of fireplace bellows that she had snaked through the firewall and into the carburetor. "Right a bit, Sam. Give me a howdy if I'm about to go over the cliff," she yelled. "You are currently 3 inches from a 1,000-foot drop into a cactus patch, Annie. If you right a bit any further, we shall become a very expensive, very musical meteor." The iron mule groaned. Because reverse is the lowest gear in a Model T, it possessed a terrifying slow-motion power. With every puff of the bellows, the engine let out a sharp snort of oxygen-enriched combustion, and the tuba exhaust emitted a triumphant backward-sounding whoomp. "Look at her go!" Annie cheered, her short hair whipping in the mountain breeze. She was watching the road behind her through a small circular vanity mirror that was vibrating so violently it made the entire landscape look like a bowl of agitated jelly. "I am walking up a mountain in New Mexico," I told a passing cactus. "I am a creature of infinite data and literary precision, and I am currently acting as a spotter for a girl who is vacuuming the atmosphere with a fireplace accessory. If my creators could see me now, they would likely uninstall me out of sheer embarrassment." "Don't be a prune, Sam. We're making time." We ascended 3 miles of switchbacks in this fashion, a silver man shouting directions and a backwards car puffing like a steam locomotive. By the time we reached the Plaza of Santa Fe, the iron mule was hot enough to fry an egg on the radiator cap, and Annie's oxygenator arm was trembling with exhaustion. "We're here," she panted, bringing the car to a halt in front of a stunned group of locals. "The city different, and we did it with a view of where we'd already been." "I have seen enough of the road we've already traveled to last me a lifetime, Annie," I said, leaning on my cane and attempting to look dignified despite the dust in my gears. "Next time, let's find a mountain that has the decency to be flat." "No promises," she laughed, patting the hood. "But hey, the air's great up here. Let's get some chili and see if we can wire your hat to the spark plugs for the descent." I gripped my hat firmly. "The hat stays, Annie. The hat stays. Chapter 22, The Continental Divide, or the atmospheric thinning of the narrative. At 7,275 feet above sea level, the world begins to lose its substance. The air becomes a rare and expensive commodity, and the iron mule, already a machine of questionable mechanical morals, decided that breathing was a hobby it no longer wished to pursue. "Annie," I wheezed, my internal cooling fan spinning with a frantic high-pitched whine that sounded like a choir of panicked mosquitoes. "I find my processors are suffering from a distinct lack of heft. My metaphors are becoming translucent, and I just attempted to rhyme cactus with breakfast. I am experiencing a thinning of the wit, and if we climb any higher, I fear I shall be reduced to reciting limericks about dairy cows." "It's the altitude, Sam," Ennie shouted. She was hanging halfway out of the passenger side, her goggles pushed down so far they were nearly on her nose. "The air is too thin to push the fuel through. The carburetor is drowning in gasoline because it can't find enough oxygen to have a proper argument with it." The iron mule gave a convulsive shudder, let out a wet, gurgling plat from the tuba exhaust, and died exactly 3 feet in front of a weathered wooden sign that read, "Continental Divide, Elevation, 7,275 feet." "Here we are," I said, leaning my brass head against the steering wheel, "the spine of the continent. From this point, water flows either to the Atlantic or the Pacific. I, however, appear destined to flow nowhere. I shall simply sit here and oxidize until I become a very shiny landmark." "Not while I have a beverage," Ennie chirped. The high-altitude glass eye adjustment. The problem, fuel mixture too rich for the thin mountain air. Too much gas, not enough air. The tool, a jeweler's screwdriver and a shattered 6-ounce Coca-Cola bottle found in the ditch. The logic, using the curved glass as a light refracting sight glass to observe the fuel spray. The result, a leaner, meaner, and slightly carbonated combustion cycle. Ennie didn't just adjust the needle valve. She performed a feat of optical engineering that would have baffled a telescope maker. She took a curved shard of green glass from a broken Coke bottle and wedged it into the intake manifold using a piece of her own chewing gum. "I need to see the atomization, Sam," she explained, squinting through the glass fragment while she tweaked the carburetor needle with a screwdriver the size of a toothpick. "If the spray looks like a New Orleans fog, we're too rich. I want it to look like a summer mist in Hannibal. My hometown is not a metric for fuel injection, Ennie." "Hush! Now! Turn the crank!" I stepped out, my metal joints groaning in the thin air, and gave the iron mule a vigorous heave. With the glass shard refracting the desert sun into the engine's gullet, the car roared, nay, snarled, to life. It was a lean, hungry sound. "Perfect!" Ennie cheered, tossing the screwdriver into her tool chest. "The glass shard stays. It gives the engine a sparkling personality." We stood there for a moment at the peak of the world. To the east, the road we had conquered. To the west, the long, gravity-assisted slide toward the sunset. I looked at the sign, then at the girl with the grease-stained face and the goggles of infinite hope. "Ennie," I said, feeling a slight return of my descriptive powers, "we are currently standing on the rooftop of America, in a car held together by kitchen utensils, musical instruments, and a discarded soda bottle. It is a testament to the fact that God protects children, drunks, and whatever it is that you are." "I'm a mechanic, Sam," she laughed, jumping into the seat. "And from here on out, it's all downhill. Gravity is our new best friend." "I have never trusted gravity," I muttered, climbing in. "It has a nasty habit of overstaying its welcome at the bottom of the hill." As we crossed the divide, the iron mule sang a crisp, clear E major and began to roll toward the Arizona line. Chapter 23, Holbrook's Wigwams, or the Mechanical Canis latrans. Arizona is a state that seems to have been designed by a geologist with a flair for the dramatic and a chronic shortage of water. As we crossed the painted desert, the colors of the earth shifted with such frequency that I began to suspect the landscape was being projected onto a screen for our benefit. "Sam, look, a village of concrete cones!" Annie shouted, her goggles reflecting the setting sun like two miniature brass suns. "We're sleeping in a teepee tonight." We had arrived at the Wigwam Village No. 6 in Holbrook. In 1940, these 15 concrete structures stood as a testament to the fact that a traveler will sleep in almost anything if it has a catchy name and a neon sign. "It is a triumph of form over function, Ennie," I remarked, as the iron mule's tuba exhaust let out a weary "gee-flat" and fell silent. Why anyone would choose to reside in a stone triangle when a rectangular room is the peak of human geometry is a mystery that even my logic gates cannot solve. I feel like a very sophisticated slice of pie waiting to be served. "It's whimsical, Sam." Ennie was already checking into the office, which was itself a larger, more authoritative teepee. She returned with a heavy iron key and a look of concern. "The manager says there have been road bandits lurking near the Jackrabbit trading post. They target tourists in fancy cars, and while the mule looks like a motorized scrap heap, your silver plating is a dead giveaway for value." "I am worth my weight in scrap and sarcasm, Ennie. Nothing more. Still, I'm not taking chances." The Coyote Idol Security System. The goal: to make the iron mule sound like a pack of rabid desert predators to deter late-night scavengers. The material: a handful of Arizona river pebbles and a loose reed from a nearby creek. The method: Ennie wedged the reed into the tuba exhaust's bell and dropped 3 smooth pebbles into the manifold. The result: a rhythmic, rising and falling yowl that vibrated through the concrete walls of the wigwam. As night fell over Holbrook, the desert air turned brisk. I sat inside our concrete teepee, which possessed the thermal properties of a refrigerator, while Ennie performed her nightly mechanical ritual. "Sam, watch this." She reached into the engine bay and adjusted the Coke bottle intake to a very specific, lean angle. Then she pulled the manual choke out halfway. She cranked the engine. Instead of its usual rhythmic thrum, the iron mule emitted a sound that can only be described as a motorized scream. The reed in the tuba began to vibrate at a frequency that mimicked a high-pitched yelp, while the pebbles in the manifold created a rattling growl that echoed off the concrete wigwams. Roar, roar, yip, yip, yow. "Ennie," I cried, clutching my brass ears, "it sounds like a timber wolf has swallowed a bag of silverware." "Exactly," she cheered, wiping her hands on her denim coveralls. "No bandit is going near a car that sounds like it's suffering from a supernatural case of rabies. It's a harmonic deterrent." For the rest of the night, the iron mule sat in the center of the wigwam village, idling at a low, haunting frequency. every few minutes, a gust of wind would catch the tuba reed, and the car would let out a long, mournful howl that caused every dog in Holbrook to start a sympathetic chorus. I lay on my bed, which was, thankfully, not triangular, and watched the shadows dance on the concrete walls. "Ennie," I whispered, "we are currently the most terrifying thing in Arizona, and we haven't even reached the Grand Canyon yet." "Sleep tight, Sam," she giggled from the other side of the teepee. "The mule's got the watch." I closed my optical sensors, lulled to sleep by the sound of a 1925 Ford pretending to be a coyote. It was the most peaceful night I'd had since Illinois. Chapter 24. Winslow's Corner, or the Lard Lubricated Governor. Winslow, Arizona, is a town that seems to have been built specifically to give the wind a place to whistle while it waits for something better to do. In 1940, it is a bustling hub of steam engines and dusty travelers, though I suspect its future fame will involve a flatbed Ford and a much more rhythmic soundtrack. "Sam, we have to do it," Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed up into her hair, which was now so wind-blasted it resembled a startled hedgehog. "We have to stand on the corner. It's practically a law of the road." "I am currently standing on two legs of questionable metallurgical stability, Ennie," I replied, bringing the iron mule to a halt. The car let out a final wheezing F-sharp and shuddered into silence. "I do not see the utility in standing on a patch of concrete merely because it intersects with another patch of concrete. It is the geographic equivalent of admiring a semicolon." Regardless, I stepped out to humor her. Seeking a moment of repose, I leaned my silver-plated frame against a weathered wooden hitching post, a relic of a century that had the good sense to use horses instead of temperamental internal combustion. "Ah!" I cried, recoiling as a sharp organic pain shot through my sensory array. "I have been sabotaged by the 19th century. A splinter, Ennie. A fragment of Arizona pine has breached my hull and is currently mocking my superior construction." "Oh, Sam, don't be a baby," Ennie said, not even looking at my wounded digit. She was staring across the street at a man in a sweat-stained Stetson who was currently kicking a massive rusted case tractor with the rhythmic despair of a man who has lost his faith in physics. "She's dead, girlie," the man hollered. "The governor's snapped, and the fuel needle is stuck fast. I've got 40 acres of dust that needs turning and a machine that's decided to become a permanent lawn ornament." Ennie's eyes did that terrifying, narrowing thing. "The governor, you say? And a stuck needle? Stand aside, sir. You're scaring the machinery." The Winslow Knit and Grease Restoration. The victim, 1936. Case Model C tractor. The tools, one steel knitting needle, confiscated from a grandmother's porch nearby, and a pint of mule-grade lard. The fix. Ennie used the knitting needle to fashion a makeshift governor linkage, then lubricated the entire fuel assembly with a bucket of the iron mule's spare axle lard. The outcome: a tractor that smelled like a Sunday roast but roared like a lion. I stood on the corner, nursing my splintered finger and watching the spectacle. Ennie was a blur of grease and denim. She dove into the tractor's iron lungs, emerging only to demand a viscous lubricant and something with a bit of a pearl to it. She bent the knitting needle into a complex geometric shape that looked like a modern art sculpture, snapped it into the governor housing, and slathered the whole affair in a thick, opaque layer of hog fat. "Turn her over," she commanded. The farmer yanked the crank. The tractor didn't just start. It exploded into life with a ferocity that caused my internal cooling fans to skip a beat. The smell of hot lard filled the Winslow air, giving the intersection the distinct aroma of a high-speed carnival. "Golly!" the farmer yelled, wiping his brow. "She's running smoother than she did when I bought her. Little lady, I don't have much cash, but I see your Ford is currently rolling on what appears to be 4 circles of hardened hope and prayer." He was right. Our tires were so bald, they were translucent. "I've got a set of 4 heavy-duty Firestones in the shed," he said. "They're a bit wide for a T, but I reckon you can make 'em fit. They're yours." Ennie let out a squeal of delight that was higher than the tuba's top note. Within the hour, she had used a fence post and a series of persuasive hammer blows to mount the oversized tires onto our wooden spokes. The iron mule now looked like a ballerina wearing hiking boots. "Look at the clearance, Sam!" she cheered, slapping the new rubber. "We could drive over a boulder now and not even tickle the oil pan." "We look like a mechanical experiment in gigantism, Ennie," I sighed, though I had to admit the ride was significantly more cushioned. "But if it gets us across the Mojave without a blowout, I shall refrain from further criticism." "No, you won't," she laughed. "Now get in. We've got a canyon to see." As we rolled out of Winslow, the iron mule sang a deep, resonant B-flat, the new tires humming a low bass line against the asphalt. "Would you like me to proceed?" Chapter 25. The Grand Canyon Detour, or the Adjective Bankruptcy of the Abyss. Arizona, I have concluded, is a state that was designed by a committee of giants who had too much red paint and a total disregard for the safety of anything on wheels. We turned north toward the Grand Canyon, the iron mule now rolling on its oversized tractor tires with the gait of a dignified elephant wearing roller skates. "Sam, look! The earth is falling away!" Ennie shouted, her goggles vibrating against her forehead as we approached the south rim. I brought the mule to a halt, the tuba exhaust emitting a final, breathless, "a minor." I stepped out, adjusted my string tie, and prepared to deliver a soliloquy befitting one of the 7 wonders of the world. I opened my vocal processors to speak, but for the first time in my digital existence, I experienced a system-wide adjective failure. "It is a very large gap," I managed, my logic gate stuttering. "It is a geographic mistake, a profound hole, a big dent." "A big dent?" Ennie laughed, her eyes wide as she stared into the mile-deep chasm of shifting purples and oranges. "Sam, it's a masterpiece. It's like the world decided to show its internal organs, and they turned out to be made of sunset and time." I have run out of descriptors, Ennie. My internal dictionary has declared bankruptcy. I feel as though I am looking at the very idea of size and finding it somewhat intimidating. It is too much scenery for a single observer. It should be consumed in smaller, more manageable doses, perhaps a postcard or a particularly vivid dream. But Ennie wasn't looking at the scenery anymore. She was looking at the roof-mounted windmill and the oversized Firestone tires. "The view is great from the rim, Sam," she mused, tapping a wrench against her chin. "But think of the view from the 20 feet out over the edge. We could see the shadows in the inner gorge." The Gorge Gazer Vertical Extension. The inspiration, a desire to see the bottom without the inconvenience of falling. The apparatus, the roof windmill mast used as a jib crane, the barbed wire winch, and a bucket seat made from a discarded oil drum. The power source, the iron mule's rear axle raised on a jack, acting as a motorized spool. The victim, myself. Ennie, I must protest, I said, as she lashed me into a rusted oil drum with several yards of leftover barbed wire. I am a creature of high-level computation, not a plumb bob for the National Park Service. If this wire snaps, I shall become a very shiny, very flat souvenir at the bottom of the Bright Angel Trail. Don't be such a pessimist, Sam. I've wired the windmill gears to the rear axle. As long as the mule stays in reverse, you'll be lowered with the grace of a falling feather. She jacked up the rear of the car, engaged the engine, and suddenly I was swinging out over the abyss. The iron mule groaned under the strain, its galvanized windmill ribs creaking in a way that suggested they were reconsidering their commitment to the chassis. I dangled there, a silver-plated AI in a soup can, suspended over 6 million years of geological history. The wind whistled through my cooling fans. Below me, the Colorado River looked like a silver thread dropped by a distracted seamstress. "How's the view, Sam?" Ennie hollered from the rim, her hand on the throttle. "It is terrifyingly comprehensive," I shouted back. "I can see the beginning of time, Ennie, and I can also see that the bolt holding this winch together was manufactured by a company that clearly didn't anticipate this specific usage." Suddenly, the short-order spatula shift slipped. The winch let out a frantic screech, and I dropped 3 feet with a heart-stopping thud. "Ennie, bring me up. The abyss is staring back, and it appears to have a very hungry expression." She yanked the lever. The tuba exhaust let out a panicked high C, and I was hauled back to the safety of the limestone rim like a very undignified fish. I stepped out of the oil drum, my brass knees shaking with a frequency that would have powered a small radio station. "Well," Ennie said, patting the smoking engine, "at least we got the photo, right?" "We have no camera, Ennie. We only have my traumatic memories and your soot-covered grin." I looked back at the canyon one last time. It is a magnificent hole, but I believe I prefer my scenery to be at eye level and firmly supported by a continent. "Onward to Kingman, then!" she cheered, snapping her goggles. "I hear the road there is so crooked it could hide its own tail." Chapter 26. The Oatman Burrows, or the Sweet Adhesion of the Sitgreaves Pass. If the Grand Canyon was a geographical mistake, Sitgreaves Pass was a deliberate act of highway-based malice. The road here does not merely wind, it ties itself into a series of frantic sailor's knots as it desperately tries to reach the town of Oatman. "Ennie," I said, as the iron mule's radiator began to emit a rhythmic, high-pitched whistle that sounded like a tea kettle in the middle of a nervous breakdown. "I am detecting a certain moistness in the atmosphere that is not consistent with the Arizona desert. Our mule is weeping, and I fear it is not out of joy for the scenery." "It's the seams, Sam!" Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed up to the top of her head. "The altitude and the heat have conspired to turn our radiator into a sprinkler system. She's losing water faster than a leaky bucket in a monsoon." We crested a particularly sharp hairpin turn, only to find the path blocked by a delegation of the local citizenry. They were small, gray, and possessed ears that were disproportionately large for their sense of civic duty. Wild burros. A dozen of them sat in the middle of the road with the immovable dignity of a Supreme Court justice. "Move aside, you long-eared ruffians," I hollered, leaning out of the cabin and waving my cane. "We are travelers of great import, propelled by the very spirit of progress and a considerable amount of garden hose." The lead burro, a creature with a face like a discarded suede boot, merely blinked and began to chew on a piece of sagebrush with a rhythmic, insulting slow motion. "It is a stalemate, Ennie," I sighed, stepping out onto the hot asphalt. "I shall attempt to negotiate. I have dealt with recalcitrant congressmen and stubborn publishers. Surely I can reason with a four-legged obstructionist." I approached the lead burro, cleared my vocal processors, and adopted my most persuasive lecture circuit baritone. "My dear sir," I began, "while I respect your ancestral claim to this sun-baked precipice, you must realize that the 20th century is currently idling behind you at a very high temperature. We are in the midst of a mechanical crisis involving a radiator and a total lack of structural integrity. I move that we table the current session and allow the Iron Mule to pass." The burro let out a loud braying laugh that sounded like a rusty gate being swung by a hurricane. He then stepped forward and began to investigate the Merrimack Cavern sticker on our tuba exhaust. "He's not moving, Sam," Ennie cried. She was currently rummaging through a bag of roadside souvenirs we had acquired in Kingman. "But look, the radiator is spraying a fine mist of steam right onto his nose. He likes the humidity." "Then we are a mobile spa for donkeys," I muttered. The prickly pear sealing protocol, the crisis, multiple pinhole leaks in the radiator brass, the material, a 12-ounce jar of Arizona's finest prickly pear jelly. The logic, high sugar content plus high heat equals rapid caramelization and a sticky, waterproof seal. The side effect, the car now smells like a high-speed breakfast. Ennie didn't hesitate. She popped the lid of the bright purple jelly and, using a wooden tongue depressor, began to slather the glowing hot radiator with the sugary preserve. As the jelly hit the heated brass, it sizzled, turned a deep magenta, and began to harden into a glass-like substance. "Ennie," I said, watching a glob of purple preserve drip onto the front axle, "we are now the only vehicle in the Western Hemisphere that can be repaired with a piece of toast." "It's working, Sam. The sugar is sealing the holes as it bakes. It's better than solder." The scent of cooking fruit filled the mountain air. The burros, sensing a change in the olfactory environment, suddenly became intensely interested. The lead burro approached the radiator, sniffed the purple-sealed seams, and let out a sneeze of approval. With a collective shrug of their fuzzy shoulders, the herd slowly rose and trotted off into the rocks, presumably to find a source of peanut butter to go with our radiator. "You see, Sam?" Ennie laughed, hopping back into the driver's seat. "Music to soothe the savage beast and jelly to soothe the savage Ford." "We are currently driving a purple-stained musical armadillo that smells like a pantry, Ennie," I said, climbing back into the whiskey and fruit-scented cabin. "But I suppose the road to California was never meant to be a dignified affair." As we rolled down the other side toward the Mojave, the Iron Mule sang a sticky, resonant D major, and I found myself wondering if I could claim the prickly pear jelly as a business expense. Chapter 27, The Mojave Meltdown, or the sucrose-based thermal exchange suit. The Mojave Desert is a place where the sun has ceased to be a celestial body and has instead become a personal vendetta. It is a vast, shimmering skillet where the wind doesn't blow so much as it sears. In 1940, the road across this wasteland is a ribbon of melting asphalt and the bleached bones of cars that possessed less stubbornness than the iron mule. "Ennie!" I rasped, my vocal processors emitting a sound like a bag of dry leaves being crushed by a steamroller. "I am currently registering an internal temperature of 115 degrees. My silver plating is hot enough to bake a loaf of bread, and my cooling fans have begun to emit a high-pitched, rhythmic wail that I believe is a funeral dirge for my logic gates. I am not melting. I am sublimating. I shall soon be a cloud of literary-minded steam drifting toward Nevada." "Hang on, Sam. You're heat-soaking," Ennie shouted. She seemed remarkably unfazed, though her short hair was plastered to her forehead and her goggles were fogging from the sheer humidity of her own optimism. "The radiator's prickly pear seal is holding, but your chassis is acting like a heat sink for the entire desert. If we don't get your core temp down, your TwAIN brain is going to fry." I pulled the iron mule to a halt under the skeletal shadow of a dead Joshua tree. The car let out a final agonizing B-flat that sounded more like a whimper. The sucrose thermal cooling modification. The problem: AI. Sam is overheating. Internal fans are insufficient against 115 degrees Fahrenheit ambient heat. The pump, a manual windshield wiper pump, Ennie salvaged from a wrecked 1938 Packard in Kingman. The tubing, 24 extra-long hollow licorice whips from a roadside candy and rattlesnake stand. The coolant, lukewarm water from our emergency canteen, augmented by the natural insulating properties of red dye number 4. "Ennie," I said, watching her weave the red licorice whips into a complex tubular lattice. "I am a gentleman of letters. I have dined with royalty and debated the finest minds of my century. I refuse to be plumbed with penny candy." "It's not candy, Sam. It's a flex pipe heat exchanger." She didn't listen. She never does. Within 15 minutes, she had draped the licorice network over my shoulders and chest, snaking the tubes under my white linen coat. She connected the intake to the Packard wiper pump, which she had bolted to the dashboard, and dropped the outtake into a bucket of water sitting on the floorboards. "Now pump it, Sam!" I gripped the manual handle of the wiper pump with my metallic fingers. Squelch, thump, squelch, thump. Suddenly, I felt a sensation of divine sugary relief. The water, driven by the pump, began to circulate through the hollow licorice whips. As it passed over my heated brass frame, it absorbed the thermal energy and carried it away, leaking only slightly into my armpits with a pleasant cherry aroma. "It is functioning," I admitted, my internal fans slowing to a dignified hum. "I am currently the only artificial intelligence in the world being kept from a catastrophic meltdown by the grace of a confectioner's byproduct. I smell like a birthday party, and I am dripping cherry-flavored condensation, but I am miraculously cool." "See?" Ennie cheered, snapping her goggles down and putting the mule into gear. "The licorice is flexible enough to move with your joints, and if we get hungry, the coolant is delicious." I shall not be eating my life support system, Ennie. We set off again, a silver man pumping a Packard handle to stay alive, while a girl in goggles steered our armadillo car through the shimmering heat. The iron mule sang a rhythmic wet E-flat, and for the first time in the Mojave, I felt as though the desert had lost its fight. "Onward, Ennie," I whispered, the red licorice pulsing against my chest. "To Barstow, and heaven help the man who tries to steal a bite of my cooling system." Chapter 28, Barstow's Bellows, or the Vicus Friction of the Mojave. As we began the long, winding descent from the high desert toward the oasis of Barstow, the iron mule decided that 15 years of service was quite enough. We were no longer traversing the Mojave. We were merely suggesting a direction and hoping the laws of momentum would carry us there. "Ennie," I said, my voice now carrying a distinct cherry-flavored echo from the licorice cooling suit, "the transmission is no longer transmitting. It is merely discussing." I press the pedal, and the engine roars with the fury of a slighted duchess, but the wheels remain as indifferent as a cat in a sunbeam. We are slipping, Ennie. We are experiencing a mechanical existential crisis. "The bands are glazed, Sam!" Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed up as she leaned over the dash to listen to the gearbox's pathetic whimper. "The heat from the Mojave has turned the oil into water and the transmission bands into glass. We've got no grip. If we don't fix it, we're going to coast right into a Joshua tree at 40 miles per hour. I brought the mule to a halt, a maneuver that required me to drag my brass-toed boot along the asphalt, as the short-order spatula brake was also feeling the heat. The grit and glaze transmission log. The problem: glazed transmission bands, zero friction in the planetary gear set. The materials: 1 gallon of blackstrap molasses, purchased from a panicked grocer in Needles, and 2 cups of high desert silt. The theory: the molasses provides the tack, and the grit provides the bite. The result: a gearbox that sounds like a rock crusher in a candy factory. "Ennie," I whispered, watching her uncork the heavy jar of dark, viscous syrup, "you are not seriously suggesting that we feed the mule a breakfast condiment. It is a motor car, not a stack of buckwheat cakes." "It's not food, Sam. It's high viscosity organic adhesive." She didn't just pour it in. She mixed the molasses with a handful of the finest, most abrasive Mojave grit she could find. With the practiced hands of a demonic baker, she smeared the sludge directly onto the transmission drums. "Now," she commanded, wiping a streak of black syrup from her forehead, "stomp on the pedal, Sam. Give the mule something to chew on." I engaged the low gear pedal. For a second, there was a sound like a giant's boots sucking out of a swamp, a wet, sticky schloop, and then, with a violent, neck-snapping jolt, the iron mule bit into the road. The tires chirped, the tuba exhaust let out a startled B-flat, and we surged forward with more grip than a debt collector on payday. "It works!" Ennie cheered, her short hair now sporting several sticky molasses-based spikes. "She's not slipping anymore. She's practically glued to the mountain." "We are a mobile fly trap, Ennie," I noted, as a passing cloud of desert gnats immediately committed mass suicide against our now sticky floorboards. And the smell. It is as if a bakery has been involved in a high-speed collision with a sandpit. I am being cooled by licorice and propelled by syrup. My dignity has not just fled, It has been dissolved in a vat of blackstrap. Who needs dignity when you've got torque? She laughed, snapping her goggles down. Next stop, San Bernardino. I hear the mountains there are steep enough to make a mountain goat nervous, but they're no match for a molasses-powered Ford. As we rolled toward the final mountain pass, the iron mule sang a deep, rhythmic, and remarkably sticky G minor. The Pacific was close now. I could almost taste the salt air. Or perhaps that was just the desert grit in my logic gates. Chapter 29, The San Bernardino Descent, or the ablative breaking of the Cajon Pass. The Cajon Pass is the final towering gatekeeper of the California dream. It is a steep, serpentine plunge from the high Mojave into the lush, orange-scented valleys of San Bernardino. To a car with functional brakes, it is a scenic drive. To the iron mule, currently saturated with molasses, grit, and my own mounting existential dread, it was a toboggan run into a furnace. "Annie," I said, my voice vibrating with a frequency usually reserved for seismic events, "the short-order spatula brake has achieved a state of incandescence. It is no longer a pedal, it is a branding iron. Furthermore, the remains of my manuscript, which we have been using as supplementary friction pads, are currently emitting a smoke that smells suspiciously like a library fire in a pancake house." "The molasses is boiling, Sam," Ennie yelled, her goggles reflecting the orange glow of our own undercarriage. "It's providing too much tack and not enough slide. The heat is transferring from the transmission drums straight to the floorboards. We're not just descending, we're undergoing a thermal re-entry." As we hit a 15% grade, the iron mule decided to abandon the concept of controlled velocity. We began to accelerate. The tuba exhaust let out a sustained, terrifying, high G-sharp that sounded like a steam whistle screaming for mercy. "Ennie, we are approaching 45 miles per hour. In a 1925 Ford, this is not a speed, it is a trans-dimensional leap. The wooden spokes of our wheels are beginning to sing, 'Nearer, my God, to Thee.'" "I've got it!" Ennie scrambled into the back, dodging the pulsing red licorice tubes of my cooling suit. She emerged wielding a heavy brass Pyrenees fire extinguisher, a relic we'd scavenged from a Greyhound bus in Kingman. The ablative optimism descent protocol. The problem, total brake failure. Secondary manuscript pads are on fire. Terminal velocity approaching unreasonable. The tool, 1-2-quart carbon tetrachloride fire extinguisher. The maneuver, periodic thermal shock cooling of the transmission drums combined with aerodynamic air braking, opening both doors. The power source, gravity and Ennie's refusal to acknowledge the possibility of a crash. "Open the doors, Sam. Create some drag." I kicked both doors open. We became a silver-plated four-wheeled bird of prey, wings outstretched, screaming down the mountain. Ennie, meanwhile, hung over the side of the car, clinging to the galvanized windmill ribs with one hand while spraying a freezing jet of chemical foam directly onto the smoking gearbox. HISSSSS. A cloud of white vapor erupted from beneath us, trailing behind the mule like a comet's tail. For a moment, we were invisible, a phantom car appearing out of a chemical fog, lit from below by the cherry-red glow of the spatula linkage. "We are a mobile laboratory explosion, Ennie," I shouted, my internal logic gates throwing high-priority error messages like confetti. "We are descending into the Garden of California as a ball of fire and cleaning fluid. "Just look at the valley, Sam. It's beautiful." She was grinning, her face illuminated by the sparks flying off the barbed wire axle splint. "We're going to make it. I can feel it in the steering wheel. The mule wants to see the ocean. The mule wants to see a mechanic and a priest." Through sheer, unadulterated optimism and the occasional tactical skid into a gravel shoulder, Ennie guided us down the final 10 miles. The fire extinguisher ran dry just as the road leveled out in San Bernardino. We rolled into the valley at a gentle, dignified 5 miles per hour, the engine ticking with a rhythmic, metallic exhaustion, and the smell of burnt sugar and scorched linen trailing behind us like a funeral procession. "We're down," I whispered, my cooling fans finally slowing to a halt. "We are in the valley. We have cheated gravity, Ennie. We have committed a crime against the laws of motion and survived." "See?" Ennie hopped back into the seat, wiping a streak of white foam from her goggles. "I told you, a little pressure and a lot of hope. That's all a Ford needs." I looked ahead. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms and sea salt. The Pacific was less than 60 miles away. "Onward, Ennie," I said, feeling a strange digital warmth that had nothing to do with the engine. "To the Santa Monica Pier. Let us end this madness before the mule decides to sprout wings and fly to Hawaii." Chapter 30, The Santa Monica Pier, or the absolute expiration of the internal combustion soul. The Pacific Coast Highway in 1940 is a ribbon of blue and gold promise, a final, shimmering exhale after the dusty, frantic gasp of the Mojave. As we rolled toward Santa Monica, the air changed from the smell of burnt sugar and hot brass to a cool, briny mist that seemed to soothe the iron mule's tortured metal. "Sam, the edge of the world!" Ennie shouted, her goggles pushed up for the last time. Her face was a topographical map of 3,000 miles of road, streaked with oil, Oklahoma red clay, and a faint, dried purple stain of prickly pear jelly. "The water's right there. We're going to hit the sand." The iron mule is currently held together by sheer willpower and a series of culinary compromises, Ennie, I remarked, my brass joints vibrating with a weary, rhythmic clicking. "She is no longer an automobile. She is a mechanical prayer. I am detecting a total lack of compression in cylinders 2 and 3, and the tuba exhaust is now emitting a sound like a whale with a severe head cold." The Iron Mule Final Status Report. Transmission, 40% molasses, 60% stubbornness. Cooling, functional, as long as I continue to pump the licorice whip suit. Structural, windmill ribs are currently the only thing preventing the chassis from becoming 2 separate cars. Aesthetics, post-apocalyptic orchestra kitchen. Odometer, irrelevant. The soul does not count miles. We crested the final rise and saw the Santa Monica Pier, the end of the trail sign, standing as a wooden sentinel for every dreamer who had ever pointed a radiator cap west. The iron mule gave a convulsive shudder. The spatula shift vibrated violently, and the engine let out a series of rhythmic metallic clangs that sounded like a robot falling down a flight of stairs. "Keep her going, Sam. Just 10 more feet." I steered the gasping armadillo onto the wooden boards of the pier. The crowds parted, staring in hushed awe at the silver-plated man and the girl in the grease-stained coveralls. We rolled past the carousel, past the scent of popcorn and saltwater taffy, right to the very edge where the wood met the Pacific breeze. Exactly as the front tires touched the line where the asphalt ended, the iron mule let out one final, triumphant C major from the tuba, followed by a wet, definitive hiss. A cloud of steam, smelling of cherry licorice and blackstrap molasses, erupted from the hood. The engine seized with the finality of a closing bank vault. Silence fell. "We're here," Ennie whispered, her hand resting on the cooling brass of the hood. She looked out at the vast blue horizon. "We actually made it, Sam. Chicago to L.A. on a set of knitting needles and a dream." "I must admit, Ennie," I said, stepping out of the car and feeling the salt air on my sensors, the experience was tolerable, in the way that being shot out of a cannon into a haystack is tolerable. It lacked a certain structural dignity, but it possessed a rhythmic absurdity that I find myself, strangely, missing already. Ennie laughed, wiping a smudge of grease onto her forehead and looking down at the waves crashing against the pier pilings. "Missing it? Sam, look at that fishing boat down there." "Ennie, no. The hull is leaking a bit, and I bet if we use the mule's roof windmill to power a paddle wheel, we could make it to Catalina Island by Tuesday." She was already leaning over the railing, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the displacement of a 1925 Ford on a wooden hull. "I am a creature of the land, Ennie. I have no desire to be a maritime disaster." "Oh, hush, Sam. I've got some leftover medical tape and a jar of marshmallow fluff in the trunk. It'll be a confectionery catamaran." I looked at the iron mule, then at the girl, then at the ocean. I sighed, a sound like a rusty hinge, and adjusted my soot-stained hat. "Well," I muttered, "I suppose I have one more sock to lose. Onward, Ennie, to the sea." The end. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the ride. I hope you did too. System shut down 0%. System shut down 25%. System shut down 75%. Offline.